Miss Spence will be down directly, sir. Thank you, said Mr. Hutton, without turning round. Janet Spence's parlour-maid was so ugly on purpose, it always seemed to him, malignantly, criminally ugly, that he could not bear to look at her more than was necessary. The door closed. Left to himself, Mr. Hutton got up and began to wander round the room, looking with meditative eyes at the familiar objects it contained. Photographs of Greek statuary, photographs of the Roman Forum, coloured prints of Italian masterpieces, all very safe and well known. Poor dear Janet, what a prig, what an intellectual snob! Her real taste was illustrated in that watercolour by the pavement artist, the one she had paid half a crown for, and 35 shillings for the frame. How often he had heard her tell the story, how often expatiate on the beauties of that skilful imitation of an oleograph, a real artist in the streets. And you could hear the capital A in artist as she spoke the words. She made you feel that part of his glory had entered into Janet Spence when she tendered him that half-crown for the copy of the oleograph. She was implying a compliment to her own taste and penetration. A genuine old master for half-a-crown. Poor dear Janet. Mr. Hutton came to a pause in front of a small oblong mirror. Stooping a little to get a full view of his face, he passed a white, well-manicured finger over his moustache. It was as curly, as freshly auburn as it had been 20 years ago. His hair still retained its colour, and there was no sign of baldness yet, only a certain elevation of the brow. Shakespearean, thought Mr. Hutton with a smile, as he surveyed the smooth and polished expanse of his forehead. Others abide our question, thou art free. Footsteps in the sea, majesty, Shakespeare, thou shouldst be living at this hour. No, that was Milton, wasn't it? Milton, the Lady of Christ's. There was no lady about him. He was what the women would call a manly man. That was why they liked him, for the curly auburn moustache and the discreet redolence of tobacco. Mr. Hutton smiled again. He enjoyed making fun of himself. Lady of Christ's? No, no. He was the Christ of ladies. Very pretty, the Christ of ladies. Mr. Hutton wished there were somebody he could tell the joke to. Poor dear Janet wouldn't appreciate it, alas. He straightened himself up, patted his hair, and resumed his peregrination. Damn the Roman Forum! He hated those dreary photographs. Suddenly he became aware that Janet Spence was in the room, standing near the door. Mr. Hutton started, as though he had been taken in some felonious act. To make these silent and spectral appearances was one of Janet Spence's peculiar talents. Perhaps she had been there all the time, had seen him looking at himself in the mirror. Impossible. But still it was disquieting. "Oh, you gave me such a surprise," said Mr. Hutton, recovering his smile and advancing with outstretched hand to meet her. Miss Spence was smiling too. Her Gioconda Smile, he had once called it, in a moment of half-ironical flattery. Miss Spence had taken the compliment seriously, and had always tried to live up to the Leonardo standard. She smiled on his silence, while Mr. Hutton shook hands. That was part of the Gioconda business. "I hope you're well," said Mr. Hutton. "You look it." What a queer face she had! The small mouth, pursed forward by the Gioconda expression into a little snout with a round hole in the middle, as though for whistling. It was like a penholder seen from the front. Above the mouth a well-shaped nose, finely aquiline, eyes large, lustrous, and dark, with the largeness, lustre, and darkness that seems to invite styes and an occasional bloodshot suffusion. They were fine eyes, but unchangingly grave. The penholder might do its Gioconda trick, but the eyes never altered their earnestness. Above them a pair of boldly arched, heavily pencilled black eyebrows lent a surprising air of power, as of a Roman matron, to the upper portion of the face. Her hair was dark and equally Roman, Agrippina from the brows upward. "I thought I'd just look in on my way home," Mr. Hutton went on. "It's good to be back here." He indicated with a wave of his hand the flowers in the vases, the sunshine and greenery beyond the windows. "It's good to be back in the country after a stuffy day of business in town." Miss Spence, who had sat down, pointed to a chair at her side. "No, really, I can't sit down," Mr. Hutton protested. "I must get back to see how poor Emily is. She was rather seedy this morning." He sat down, nevertheless. "It's these wretched liver chills. She's always getting them. Women—" He broke off and coughed so as to hide the fact that he had uttered. He was about to say that women with weak digestions ought not to marry, but the remark was too cruel, and he didn't really believe it. Janet Spence, moreover, was a believer in eternal flames and spiritual attachments. "She hopes to be well enough," he added, "to see you at luncheon to-morrow. Can you come? Do." He smiled persuasively. "It's my invitation too, you know." She dropped her eyes, and Mr. Hutton almost thought that he detected a certain reddening of the cheek. It was a tribute. He stroked his moustache. "I should like to come if you think Emily's really well enough to have a visitor. Of course, you'll do her good. You'll do us both good. In married life 3 is often better company than 2. "Oh, you're cynical." Mr. Hutton always had a desire to say "bow wow wow" whenever that last word was spoken. It irritated him more than any other word in the language. But instead of barking, he made haste to protest. "No, no, I'm only speaking a melancholy truth. Reality doesn't always come up to the ideal, you know. But that doesn't make me believe any the less in the ideal. Indeed, I believe in it passionately. The ideal of a matrimony between 2 people in perfect accord. I think it's realizable. I'm sure it is." He paused significantly and looked at her with an arch expression. A virgin of 36, but still unwithered, she had her charms, and there was something really rather enigmatic about her. Miss Spence made no reply, but continued to smile. There were times when Mr. Hutton got rather bored with the Gioconda. He stood up. "I must really be going now. Farewell, mysterious Gioconda." The smile grew intenser, focussed itself, as it were, in a narrower snout. Mr. Hutton made a cinquecento gesture and kissed her extended hand. It was the first time he had done such a thing. The action seemed not to be resented. "I look forward to tomorrow." "Do you?" For answer, Mr. Hutton once more kissed her hand, then turned to go. Miss Spence accompanied him to the porch. "Where's your car?" she asked. "I left it at the gate of the drive." "I'll come and see you off." "No, no." Mr. Hutton was playful but determined. "You must do no such thing. I simply forbid you." "But I should like to come," Miss Spence protested, throwing a rapid Gioconda at him. Mr. Hutton held up his hand. "No," he repeated, and then, with a gesture that was almost the blowing of a kiss, he started to run down the drive, lightly, on his toes, with long bounding strides, like a boy's. He was proud of that run. It was quite marvellously youthful. Still, he was glad the drive was no longer. At the last bend, before passing out of sight of the house, he halted and turned round. Miss Spence was still standing on the steps, smiling her smile. He waved his hand, and this time quite definitely and overtly wafted a kiss in her direction. Then, breaking once more into his magnificent canter, he rounded the last dark promontory of trees. Once out of sight of the house, he let his high paces decline to a trot, and finally to a walk. He took out his handkerchief and began wiping his neck inside his collar. What fools! What fools! Had there ever been such an ass as poor dear Janet Spence? Never, unless it was himself. Decidedly he was the more malignant fool, since he at least was aware of his folly, and still persisted in it. Why did he persist? The problem that was himself, the problem that was other people. He had reached the gate. A large, prosperous-looking motor was standing at the side of the road. "Home, Nab?" The chauffeur touched his cap. "And stop at the cross-roads on the way, as usual," Mr. Hutton added, as he opened the door of the car. "Well," he said, speaking into the obscurity that lurked within. "Oh, Teddy Bear, what an age you've been!" It was a fresh and childish voice that spoke these words. There was the faintest hint of Cockney impurity about the vowel sounds. Mr. Hutton bent his large form and darted into the car with the agility of an animal regaining its burrow. "Have I?" he said, as he shut the door. The machine began to move. "You must have missed me a lot, if you find the time so long." He sat back in the low seat. A cherishing warmth enveloped him. "Teddy Bear!" And with a sigh of contentment, a charming little head declined on to Mr. Hutton's shoulder. Ravished, he looked down sideways at the round, babyish face. "Do you know, Doris, you look like the pictures of Louise de Querouaille." He passed his fingers through a mass of curly hair. "Who's Louise de Querouaille, whatever it is?" Doris spoke from remote distances. "She was, alas. We shall all be was one of these days." Meanwhile, Mr. Hutton covered the babyish face with kisses. The car rushed smoothly along. Nab's back, through the front window, was stonily impassive, the back of a statue. "Your hands," Doris whispered. "Oh, you mustn't touch me. They give me electric shocks." Mr. Hutton adored her for the virgin imbecility of the words. How late in one's existence one makes the discovery of one's body! "The electricity isn't in me, it's in you." He kissed her again, whispering her name several times. Doris, Doris, Doris. The scientific appellation of the sea mouse, he was thinking, as he kissed the throat she offered him, white and extended, like the throat of a victim awaiting the sacrificial knife. The sea mouse was a sausage with iridescent fur, very peculiar. Or was Doris the sea cucumber, which turns itself inside out in moments of alarm? He would really have to go to Naples again, just to see the aquarium. These sea creatures were fabulous, unbelievably fantastic. "Oh, Teddy Bear!" More zoology. But he was only a land animal. His poor little jokes. "Teddy Bear, I'm so happy." "So am I," said Mr. Hutton. Was it true? "But I wish I knew if it were right. Tell me, Teddy Bear, is it right or wrong?" "Ah, my dear, that's just what I've been wondering for the last 30 years." "Be serious, Teddy Bear. I want to know if this is right. If it's right that I should be here with you, and that we should love one another, and that it should give me electric shocks when you touch me." "Right? Well, it's certainly good that you should have electric shocks rather than sexual repressions. Read Freud. Repressions are the devil." "Oh, you don't help me. Why aren't you ever serious? If only you knew how miserable I am sometimes, thinking it's not right. Perhaps you know there is a hell and all that. I don't know what to do. Sometimes I think I ought to stop loving you." "But could you?" asked Mr. Hutton, confident in the powers of his seduction and his moustache. "No, Teddy Bear, you know I couldn't. But I could run away. I could hide from you. I could lock myself up and force myself not to come to you." "Silly little thing!" He tightened his embrace. "Oh dear, I hope it isn't wrong. And there are times when I don't care if it is." Mr. Hutton was touched. He had a certain protective affection for this little creature. He laid his cheek against her hair, and so, interlaced, they sat in silence, while the car, swaying and pitching a little as it hastened along, seemed to draw in the white road and the dusty hedges towards it, devouring. "Good-bye, good-bye." The car moved on, gathered speed, vanished round a curve, and Doris was left standing by the sign-post at the cross-roads, still dizzy and weak with the languor born of those kisses and the electrical touch of those gentle hands. She had to take a deep breath to draw herself up deliberately before she was strong enough to start her homeward walk. She had half a mile in which to invent the necessary lies. Alone, Mr. Hutton suddenly found himself the prey of an appalling boredom. Mrs. Hutton was lying on the sofa in her boudoir, playing Patience. In spite of the warmth of the July evening, a wood fire was burning on the hearth. A black Pomeranian, extenuated by the heat and the fatigues of digestion, slept before the blaze. "Isn't it rather hot in here?" Mr. Hutton asked, as he entered the room. "You know I have to keep warm, dear." The voice seemed breaking on the verge of tears. "I get so shivery. I hope you're better this evening." "Not much, I'm afraid." The conversation stagnated. Mr. Hutton stood leaning his back against the mantelpiece. He looked down at the Pomeranian lying at his feet, and with the toe of his right boot he rolled the little dog over and rubbed its white-flecked chest and belly. The creature lay in an inert ecstasy. Mrs. Hutton continued to play Patience. Arrived at an impasse, she altered the position of one card, took back another, and went on playing. Her Patiences always came out. "Dr. Libbard thinks I ought to go to Landridnod Wells this summer." "Well, go, my dear, go most certainly." Mr. Hutton was thinking of the events of the afternoon, how they had driven, Doris and he, up to the hanging wood, had left the car to wait for them under the shade of the trees, and walked out into the windless sunshine of the chalk down. "I'm to drink the waters for my liver, and he thinks I ought to have massage and electric treatment." Hat in hand, Doris had stalked 4 blue butterflies that were dancing together round a scabious flower, with a motion that was like the flickering of blue fire. The blue fire burst and scattered into whirling sparks. She had given chase, laughing and shouting like a child. "I'm sure it will do you good, my dear." "I was wondering if you'd come with me, dear. But you know I'm going to Scotland at the end of the month." Mrs. Hutton looked up at him entreatingly. "It's the journey," she said. "The thought of it is such a nightmare. I don't know if I can manage it. And you know I can't sleep in hotels, and then there's the luggage and all the worries. I can't go alone." "But you won't be alone. You'll have your maid with you." He spoke impatiently. The sick woman was usurping the place of the healthy one. He was being dragged back from the memory of the sunlit down and the quick laughing girl, back to this unhealthy, overheated room and its complaining occupant. "I don't think I shall be able to go." "But you must, my dear, if the doctor tells you to. And besides, a change will do you good." "I don't think so." "But Libbard thinks so, and he knows what he's talking about." "No, I can't face it. I'm too weak. I can't go alone." Mrs. Hutton pulled a handkerchief out of her black silk bag and put it to her eyes. "Nonsense, my dear, you must make the effort." "I'd rather be left in peace to die here." She was crying in earnest now. "Oh, Lord, now do be reasonable. Listen, now, please." Mrs. Hutton only sobbed more violently. "Oh, what is one to do?" He shrugged his shoulders and walked out of the room. Mr. Hutton was aware that he had not behaved with proper patience, but he could not help it. Very early in his manhood he had discovered that not only did he not feel sympathy for the poor, the weak, the diseased, and deformed. He actually hated them. Once, as an undergraduate, he spent 3 days at a mission in the East End. He had returned filled with a profound and ineradicable disgust. Instead of pitying, he loathed the unfortunate. It was not, he knew, a very comely emotion, and he had been ashamed of it at first. In the end he had decided that it was temperamental, inevitable, and had felt no further qualms. Emily had been healthy and beautiful when he married her. He had loved her then. But now, was it his fault that she was like this? Mr. Hutton dined alone. Food and drink left him more benevolent than he had been before dinner. To make amends for his show of exasperation, he went up to his wife's room and offered to read to her. She was touched, gratefully accepted the offer, and Mr. Hutton, who was particularly proud of his accent, suggested a little light reading in French. French? I am so fond of French. Mrs. Hutton spoke of the language of Racine as though it were a dish of green peas. Mr. Hutton ran down to the library and returned with a yellow volume. He began reading. The effort of pronouncing perfectly absorbed his whole attention. But how good his accent was! The fact of its goodness seemed to improve the quality of the novel he was reading. At the end of 15 pages an unmistakable sound aroused him. He looked up. Mrs. Hutton had gone to sleep. He sat still for a while, looking with a dispassionate curiosity at the sleeping face. Once it had been beautiful. Once, long ago, the sight of it, the recollection of it, had moved him with an emotion profounder, perhaps, than any he had felt before or since. Now it was lined and cadaverous. The skin was stretched tightly over the cheekbones, across the bridge of the sharp, bird-like nose. The closed eyes were set in profound, bone-rimmed sockets. The lamplight, striking on the face from the side, emphasized with light and shade its cavities and projections. It was the face of a dead Christ by Morales. Le squelette était invisible aux temps heureux de l'art payant. He shivered a little and tiptoed out of the room. On the following day Mrs. Hutton came down to luncheon. She had had some unpleasant palpitations during the night, but she was feeling better now. Besides, she wanted to do honour to her guest. Miss Spence listened to her complaints about Llandrindod Wells, and was loud in sympathy, lavish with advice. Whatever she said was always said with intensity. She leaned forward, aimed, so to speak, like a gun, and fired her words. Bang! The charge in her soul was ignited. The words whizzed forth at the narrow barrel of her mouth. She was a machine gun, riddling her hostess with sympathy. Mr. Hutton had undergone similar bombardments, mostly of a literary or philosophic character. Bombardments of Maeterlinck, of Mrs. Besant, of Bergson, of William James. To-day the missiles were medical. She talked about insomnia. She expatiated on the virtues of harmless drugs and beneficent specialists. Under the bombardment, Mrs. Hutton opened out like a flower in the sun. Mr. Hutton looked on in silence. The spectacle of Janice Spence evoked in him an unfailing curiosity. He was not romantic enough to imagine that every face masked an interior physiognomy of beauty or strangeness, that every woman's small talk was like a vapour hanging over mysterious gulfs. His wife, for example, and Doris, they were nothing more than what they seemed to be. But with Janet Spence it was somehow different. Here one could be sure that there was some kind of a queer face behind the Gioconda smile and the Roman eyebrows. The only question was, what exactly was there? Mr. Hutton could never quite make it out. "But perhaps you won't have to go to Llandrindod after all," Miss Spence was saying. "If you get well quickly, Dr. Libbert will let you off." "I only hope so. Indeed, I do really feel rather better to-day." Mr. Hutton felt ashamed. How much was it his own lack of sympathy that prevented her from feeling well every day? But he comforted himself by reflecting that it was only a case of feeling, not of being, better. Sympathy does not mend a diseased liver or a weak heart. "My dear, I wouldn't eat those red currants if I were you," he said, suddenly solicitous. "You know that Libbert has banned everything with skins and pips." "But I am so fond of them," Mrs. Hutton protested, "and I feel so well to-day." "Don't be a tyrant," said Miss Spence, looking first at him and then at his wife. "Let the poor invalid have what she fancies. It will do her good." She laid her hand on Mrs. Hutton's arm and patted it affectionately 2 or 3 times. "Thank you, my dear." Mrs. Hutton helped herself to the stewed currants. "Well, don't blame me if they make you ill again." "Do I ever blame you, dear?" "You have nothing to blame me for," Mr. Hutton answered playfully. "I am the perfect husband." They sat in the garden after luncheon. From the island of shade under the old cypress tree they looked out across a flat expanse of lawn in which the parterre of flowers shone with a metallic brilliance. Mr. Hutton took a deep breath of the warm and fragrant air. "It's good to be alive," he said. "Just to be alive," his wife echoed, stretching one pale, not-jointed hand into the sunlight. A maid brought the coffee. The silver pots and the little blue cups were set on a folding table near the group of chairs. "Oh, my medicine!" exclaimed Mrs. Hutton. "Run in and fetch it, Clara, will you? The white bottle on the sideboard." "I'll go," said Mr. Hutton. "I've got to go and fetch a cigar in any case." He ran in towards the house. On the threshold he turned round for an instant. The maid was walking back across the lawn. His wife was sitting up in her deck chair, engaged in opening her white parasol. Miss Spence was bending over the table, pouring out the coffee. He passed into the cool obscurity of the house. "Do you like sugar in your coffee?" Miss Spence inquired. "Yes, please. Give me rather a lot. I'll drink it after my medicine to take the taste away." Mrs. Hutton leaned back in her chair, lowering the sunshade over her eyes so as to shut out from her vision the burning sky. Behind her Miss Spence was making a delicate clinking among the coffee cups. "I've given you 3 large spoonfuls. That ought to take the taste away. And here comes the medicine." Mr. Hutton had reappeared, carrying a wine-glass half full of a pale liquid. "It smells delicious," he said, as he handed it to his wife. "That's only the flavouring." She drank it off at a gulp, shuddered, and made a grimace. "Ugh, it's so nasty. Give me my coffee." Miss Spence gave her the cup. She sipped at it. "You've made it like syrup. But it's very nice after that atrocious medicine." At 3:30 Mrs. Hutton complained that she did not feel as well as she had done, and went indoors to lie down. Her husband would have said something about the red currants, but checked himself. The triumph of an "I told you so" was too cheaply won. Instead, he was sympathetic, and gave her his arm to the house. "A rest will do you good," he said. "By the way, I shan't be back till after dinner." "But why? Where are you going?" "I promised to go to Johnson's this evening. We have to discuss the War Memorial, you know." "Oh, I wish you weren't going." Mrs. Hutton was almost in tears. "Can't you stay? I don't like being alone in the house." "But, my dear, I promised weeks ago." It was a bother having to lie like this. "And now I must get back and look after Miss Spence." He kissed her on the forehead and went out again into the garden. Miss Spence received him, aimed and intense. "Your wife is dreadfully ill," she fired off at him. "I thought she cheered up so much when you came." "That was purely nervous, purely nervous. I was watching her closely. With a heart in that condition, and her digestion wrecked, yes, wrecked, anything might happen. Libbert doesn't take so gloomy a view of poor Emily's health. Mr. Hutton held open the gate that led from the garden into the drive. Miss Spence's car was standing by the front door. "Libbard is only a country doctor. You ought to see a specialist." He could not refrain from laughing. "You have a macabre passion for specialists." Miss Spence held up her hand in protest. "I am serious. I think poor Emily is in a very bad state. Anything might happen at any moment." He handed her into the car and shut the door. The chauffeur started the engine and climbed into his place, ready to drive off. "Shall I tell him to start?" He had no desire to continue the conversation. Miss Spence leaned forward and shot a Gioconda in his direction. "Remember, I expect you to come and see me again soon." Mechanically he grinned, made a polite noise, and, as the car moved forward, waved his hand. He was happy to be alone. A few minutes afterwards Mr. Hutton drove himself away. Doris was waiting at the crossroads. They dined together, 20 miles from home, at a roadside hotel. It was one of those bad, expensive meals which are only cooked in country hotels frequented by motorists. It revolted Mr. Hutton, but Doris enjoyed it. She always enjoyed things. Mr. Hutton ordered a not very good brand of champagne. He was wishing he had spent the evening in his library. When they started homewards, Doris was a little tipsy and extremely affectionate. It was very dark inside the car, but looking forward, past the motionless form of Nab, they could see a bright and narrow universe of forms and colours scooped out of the night by the electric headlamps. It was after 11 when Mr. Hutton reached home. Dr. Libbard met him in the hall. He was a small man with delicate hands and well-formed features that were almost feminine. His brown eyes were large and melancholy. He used to waste a great deal of time sitting at the bedsides of his patients, looking sadness through those eyes, and talking, in a sad, low voice, about nothing in particular. His person exhaled a pleasing odour, decidedly antiseptic, but at the same time suave and discreetly delicious. "Libbard," said Mr. Hutton in surprise. "You here? Is my wife ill?" "We tried to fetch you earlier," said the soft, melancholy voice. "It was thought you were at Mr. Johnson's, but they had no news of you there." "No, I was detained. I had a breakdown," Mr. Hutton answered irritably. It was tiresome to be caught out in a lie. "Your wife wanted to see you urgently." "Well, I can go now." Mr. Hutton moved towards the stairs. Dr. Libbard laid a hand on his arm. "I'm afraid it's too late." "Too late?" He began fumbling with his watch. It wouldn't come out of the pocket. "Mrs. Hutton passed away half an hour ago." The voice remained even in its softness. The melancholy of the eyes did not deepen. Dr. Libbard spoke of death as he would speak of a local cricket match. All things were equally vain and equally deplorable. Mr. Hutton found himself thinking of Janet Spence's words. At any moment, at any moment. She had been extraordinarily right. "What happened?" he asked. "What was the cause?" Dr. Libbard explained. It was heart failure, brought on by a violent attack of nausea, caused, in its turn, by the eating of something of an irritant nature. "Red currants?" Mr. Hutton suggested. "Very likely. It had been too much for the heart. There was chronic valvular disease. Something had collapsed under the strain. It was all over. She could not have suffered much." End of chapter 1, part 1. The Gioconda Smile, part 2. "It's a pity they should have chosen the day of the Eton and Harrow match for the funeral," old General Grego was saying, as he stood, his top hat in his hand, under the shadow of the lich gate, wiping his face with his handkerchief. Mr. Hutton overheard the remark, and with difficulty restrained a desire to inflict grievous bodily pain on the General. He would have liked to hit the old brute in the middle of his big red face. monstrous great mulberry spotted with meal. Was there no respect for the dead? Did nobody care? In theory, he didn't much care. Let the dead bury their dead. But here, at the gravesite, he had found himself actually sobbing. Poor Emily! They had been pretty happy once. Now she was lying at the bottom of a 7-foot hole. And here was Grego complaining that he couldn't go to the Eton and Harrow match. Mr. Hutton looked round at the groups of black figures that were drifting slowly out of the churchyard towards the fleet of cabs and motors assembled in the road outside, against the brilliant background of the July grass and flowers and foliage. They had a horribly alien and unnatural appearance. It pleased him to think that all these people would soon be dead too. That evening Mr. Hutton sat up late in his library, reading the Life of Milton. There was no particular reason why he should have chosen Milton. It was the book that first came to hand, that was all. It was after midnight when he had finished. He got up from his armchair, unbolted the French windows, and stepped out onto the little paved terrace. The night was quiet and clear. Mr. Hutton looked at the stars, and at the holes between them, dropped his eyes to the dim lawns and hueless flowers of the garden, and let them wander over the farther landscape, black and grey under the moon. He began to think with a kind of confused violence. There were the stars. There was Milton. A man can be somehow the peer of stars and the night. Greatness, nobility. But is there seriously a difference between the noble and the ignoble? Milton, the stars, death, and himself, the soul, the body, the higher and the lower nature. Perhaps there was something in it, after all. Milton had a God on his side, and righteousness. What had he? Nothing. Nothing whatever. There were only Doris's little breasts. What was the point of it all? Milton, the stars, death, and Emily in her grave. Doris and himself. Always himself. Oh, he was a futile and disgusting being. Everything convinced him of it. It was a solemn moment. He spoke aloud. I will. I will. The sound of his own voice in the darkness was appalling. It seemed to him that he had sworn that infernal oath which binds even the gods. I will. I will. There had been New Year's days and solemn anniversaries in the past when he had felt the same contritions and recorded similar resolutions. They had all thinned away, these resolutions, like smoke into nothingness. But this was a greater moment, and he had pronounced a more fearful oath. In the future it was to be different. Yes, he would live by reason. He would be industrious. He would curb his appetites. He would devote his life to some good purpose. It was resolved, and it would be so. In practice, he saw himself spending his mornings in agricultural pursuits, riding round with the bailiff, seeing that his land was farmed in the best modern way. Silos and artificial manures and continuous cropping and all that. The remainder of the day should be devoted to serious study. There was that book he had been intending to write for so long, The Effect of Diseases on Civilization. Mr. Hutton went to bed humble and contrite, but with the sense that grace had entered into him. He slept for 7.5 hours and woke to find the sun brilliantly shining. The emotions of the evening before had been transformed by a good night's rest into his customary cheerfulness. It was not until a good many seconds after his return to conscious life that he remembered his resolution, his Stygian oath. Milton and death seemed somehow different in the sunlight. As for the stars, they were not there. But the resolutions were good. Even in the daytime he could see that. He had his horse saddled after breakfast and rode round the farm with the bailiff. After luncheon he read Thucydides on the plague at Athens. In the evening he made a few notes on malaria in southern Italy. While he was undressing, he remembered that there was a good anecdote in Skelton's jest book about the sweating sickness. He would have made a note of it, if only he could have found a pencil. On the 6th morning of his new life, Mr. Hutton found, among his correspondence, an envelope addressed in that peculiarly vulgar handwriting which he knew to be Doris's. He opened it and began to read. She didn't know what to say. Words were so inadequate. His wife dying like that, and so suddenly. It was too terrible. Mr. Hutton sighed. But his interest revived somewhat as he read on. Death is so frightening. I never think of it when I can help it. But when something like this happens, or when I am feeling ill or depressed, then I can't help remembering it is there, so close, and I think about all the wicked things I've done, and about you and me, and I wonder what will happen, and I'm so frightened. I am so lonely, Teddy Bear, and so unhappy, and I don't know what to do. I can't get rid of the idea of dying. I'm so wretched and helpless without you. I didn't mean to write to you. I meant to wait till you were out of mourning and could come see me again. But I was so lonely and miserable, Teddy Bear. I had to write. I couldn't help it. Forgive me. I want you so much. I have nobody in the world but you. You are so good and gentle and understanding. There is nobody like you. I shall never forget how good and kind you've been to me. And you are so clever and know so much. I can't understand how you ever came to pay any attention to me. I'm so dull and stupid. Much less like me and love me. Because you do love me a little, don't you, Teddy Bear? Mr. Hutton was touched with shame and remorse. To be thanked like this, worshipped, for having seduced the girl, it was too much. It had just been a piece of imbecile wantonness. Imbecile, idiotic. There was no other way to describe it, for when all was said, he had derived very little pleasure from it. Taking all things together, he had probably been more bored than amused. Once upon a time he had believed himself to be a hedonist, but to be a hedonist implies a certain process of reasoning, a deliberate choice of known pleasures, a rejection of known pains. This had been done without reason, against it, for he knew beforehand so well, that there was no interest or pleasure to be derived from these wretched affairs, and yet each time the vague itch came upon him, he succumbed, involving himself once more in the old stupidity. There had been Maggie, his wife's maid, and Edith, the girl on the farm, and Mrs. Pringle, and the waitress in London, and others. There seemed to be dozens of them. It had all been so stale and boring. He knew it would be. He always knew. And yet, experience doesn't teach. Poor little Doris. He would write to her kindly, comfortingly, but he wouldn't see her again. A servant came to tell him that his horse was saddled and waiting. He mounted and rode off. That morning the old bailiff was rather more irritating than usual. 5 days later, Doris and Mr. Hutton were sitting together on the pier at Southend. Doris, in white muslin with pink garnishings, radiated happiness. Mr. Hutton, legs outstretched and chair tilted, had pushed the Panama back from his forehead and was trying to feel like a tripper. That night, when Doris was asleep, breathing and warm by his side, he recaptured, in this moment of darkness and physical fatigue, the rather cosmic emotion which had possessed him that evening, not a fortnight ago, when he had made his great resolution. And so his solemn oath had already gone the way of so many other resolutions. Unreason had triumphed. At the first itch of desire he had given way. He was hopeless. Hopeless. For a long time he lay with closed eyes, ruminating his humiliation. The girl stirred in her sleep. Mr. Hutton turned over and looked in her direction. Enough faint light crept in between the half-drawn curtains to show her bare arm and shoulder, her neck, and the dark tangle of hair on the pillow. She was beautiful, desirable. Why did he lie there, moaning over his sins? What did it matter? If he were hopeless, then so be it. He would make the best of his hopelessness. A glorious sense of irresponsibility suddenly filled him. He was free, magnificently free. In a kind of exaltation, he drew the girl towards him. She woke, bewildered, almost frightened, under his rough kisses. The storm of his desire subsided into a kind of serene merriment. The whole atmosphere seemed to be quivering with enormous, silent laughter. "Could anyone love you as much as I do, Teddy Bear?" The question came faintly from distant worlds of love. "I think I know somebody who does," Mr. Hutton replied. The submarine laughter was swelling, rising, ready to break the surface of silence and resound. "Who? Tell me. What do you mean?" The voice had come very close, charged with suspicion, anguish, indignation. It belonged to this immediate world. "Who?" "You'll never guess." Mr. Hutton kept up the joke until it began to grow tedious, and then pronounced the name. Janet Spence. Doris was incredulous. "Miss Spence of the Manor? That old woman?" It was too ridiculous. Mr. Hutton laughed too. "But it's quite true," he said. "She adores me. Oh, the vast joke!" He would go and see her as soon as he returned. See and conquer. "I believe she wants to marry me," he added. "But you wouldn't. You don't intend—" The air was fairly crepitating with humour. Mr. Hutton laughed aloud. "I intend to marry you," he said. It seemed to him the best joke he had ever made in his life. When Mr. Hutton left Southend, he was once more a married man. It was agreed that for the time being the fact should be kept secret. In the autumn they would go abroad together, and the world should be informed. Meanwhile, he was to go back to his own house and Doris to hers. The day after his return he walked over in the afternoon to see Miss Spence. She received him with the old Gioconda. "I was expecting you to come." "I couldn't keep away," Mr. Hutton gallantly replied. They sat in the summer house. It was a pleasant place, a little old stucco temple, bowered among dense bushes of evergreen. Miss Spence had left her mark on it by hanging up over the seat a blue and white Della Robbia plaque. "I am thinking of going to Italy this autumn," said Mr. Hutton. He felt like a ginger beer bottle ready to pop with bubbling, humorous excitement. "Italy!" Miss Spence closed her eyes ecstatically. "I feel drawn there too." "Why not let yourself be drawn?" "I don't know. One somehow hasn't the energy and initiative to set out alone." Alone! The sound of guitars and throaty singing. Yes, travelling alone isn't much fun. Miss Spence lay back in her chair without speaking. Her eyes were still closed. Mr. Hutton stroked his moustache. The silence prolonged itself for what seemed a very long time. Pressed to stay to dinner, Mr. Hutton did not refuse. The fun had hardly started. The table was laid in the loggia. Through its arches they looked out on to the sloping garden, to the valley below and the farther hills. Light ebbed away. The heat and silence were oppressive. A huge cloud was mounting up the sky, and there were distant breathings of thunder. The thunder drew nearer. A wind began to blow, and the first drops of rain fell. The table was cleared. Miss Spence and Mr. Hutton sat on in the growing darkness. Miss Spence broke a long silence by saying meditatively, "I think everyone has a right to a certain amount of happiness, don't you?" Most certainly. But what was she leading up to? Nobody makes generalisations about life unless they mean to talk about themselves. Happiness. He looked back on his own life and saw a cheerful, placid existence, disturbed by no great griefs or discomforts or alarms. He had always had money and freedom. He had been able to do very much as he wanted. Yes, he supposed he had been happy, happier than most men. And now he was not merely happy. He had discovered in irresponsibility the secret of gaiety. He was about to say something about his happiness when Miss Spence went on speaking. "People like you and me have a right to be happy some time in our lives." "Me?" said Mr. Hutton, surprised. "Poor Henry! Fate hasn't treated either of us very well." "Oh, well, it might have treated me worse." "You're being cheerful. That's brave of you. But don't think I can't see behind the mask." Miss Spence spoke louder and louder as the rain came down more and more heavily. Periodically the thunder cut across her utterances. She talked on, shouting against the noise. "I have understood you so well and for so long." A flash revealed her, aimed and intent, leaning towards him. Her eyes were two profound and menacing gun barrels. The darkness re-engulfed her. "You were a lonely soul, seeking a companion soul. I could sympathize with you in your solitude. Your marriage—" The thunder cut short the sentence. Miss Spence's voice became audible once more with the words, "could offer no companionship to a man of your stamp. You needed a soul-mate." A soul-mate? He a soul-mate? It was incredibly fantastic. Georgette Leblanc, the ex-soul-mate of Maurice Maeterlinck. He had seen that in the paper a few days ago. So it was thus that Janet Spence had painted him, in her imagination, a soul-mater. And for Doris he was a picture of goodness and the cleverest man in the world. And actually, really, he was what? Who knows? My heart went out to you. I could understand. I was lonely too. Miss Spence laid her hand on his knee. You were so patient. Another flash. She was still aimed dangerously. You never complained. But I could guess. I could guess. How wonderful of you. So he was an âme incomprise. Only a woman's intuition. The thunder crashed and rumbled, died away, and only the sound of the rain was left. The thunder was his laughter, magnified, externalized. Flash and crash, there it was again, right on top of them. "Don't you feel that you have within you something that is akin to this storm?" He could imagine her leaning forward as she uttered the words. "Passion makes one the equal of the elements." What was his gambit now? Why, obviously he should have said yes, and ventured on some unequivocal gesture. But Mr. Hutton suddenly took fright. The ginger beer in him had gone flat. The woman was serious, terribly serious. He was appalled. Passion? "No," he desperately answered. "I am without passion." But his remark was either unheard or unheeded, for Miss Spence went on with a growing exultation, speaking so rapidly, however, and in such a burningly intimate whisper, that Mr. Hutton found it very difficult to distinguish what she was saying. She was telling him, as far as he could make out, the story of her life. The lightning was less frequent now, and there were long intervals of darkness. But at each flash he saw her, still aiming towards him, still yearning forward with a terrifying intensity. Darkness, the rain, and then flash! Her face was there, close at hand, a pale mask, greenish white. The large eyes, the narrow barrel of the mouth, the heavy eyebrows. Agrippina. Or wasn't it rather... Yes, wasn't it rather George Robey? He began devising absurd plans for escaping. He might suddenly jump up, pretending he'd seen a burglar. "Stop thief! Stop thief!" and dash off into the night in pursuit. Or should he say that he felt faint, a heart attack, or that he had seen a ghost, Emily's ghost, in the garden? Absorbed in his childish plotting, he had ceased to pay any attention to Miss Spence's words. The spasmodic clutching of her hand recalled his thoughts. "I honoured you for that, Henry," she was saying. Honoured him? For what? Marriage is a sacred tie, and your respect for it, even when the marriage was, as it was in your case, an unhappy one, made me respect you and admire you and... Shall I dare say the word? Oh, the burglar, the ghost in the garden! But it was too late. Yes, love you, Henry, all the more. But we're free now, Henry. Free? There was a movement in the dark, and she was kneeling on the floor by his chair. "Oh, Henry, Henry, I have been unhappy too." Her arms embraced him, and by the shaking of her body he could feel that she was sobbing. She might have been a suppliant crying for mercy. "You mustn't, Janet," he protested. Those tears were terrible, terrible. "Not now, not now. You must be calm. You must go to bed." He patted her shoulder, then got up, disengaging himself from her embrace. He left her, still crouching on the floor beside the chair on which he'd been sitting. Groping his way into the hall, and without waiting to look for his hat, he went out of the house, taking infinite pains to close the front door noiselessly behind him. The clouds had blown over, and the moon was shining from a clear sky. There were puddles all along the road, and a noise of running water rose from the gutters and ditches. Mr. Hutton splashed along, not caring if he got wet. How heart-rendingly she had sobbed, with the emotions of pity and remorse that the recollection evoked in him. There was a certain resentment. Why couldn't she have played the game that he was playing, the heartless, amusing game? Yes, but he had known all the time that she wouldn't, she couldn't play that game. He had known, and persisted. What had she said about passion and the elements? Something absurdly stale, but true, true. There she was, a cloud, black, bosomed, and charged with thunder. And he, like some absurd little Benjamin Franklin, had sent up a kite into the heart of the menace. Now he was complaining that his toy had drawn the lightning. She was probably still kneeling by that chair in the loggia, crying. But why hadn't he been able to keep up the game? Why had his irresponsibility deserted him, leaving him suddenly sober in a cold world? There were no answers to any of his questions. One idea burned steady and luminous in his mind, the idea of flight. He must get away at once. "What are you thinking about, Teddy bear?" Nothing. There was a silence. Mr. Hutton remained motionless, his elbows on the parapet of the terrace, his chin in his hands, looking down over Florence. He had taken a villa on one of the hilltops to the south of the city. From a little raised terrace at the end of the garden one looked down a long, fertile valley on to the town, and beyond it to the bleak mass of Monte Morello, and eastward of it to the peopled hill of Fiesole, dotted with white houses. Everything was clear and luminous in the September sunshine. "Are you worried about anything?" "No, thank you." "Tell me, Teddy bear." "But, my dear, there's nothing to tell." Mr. Hutton turned round, smiled, and patted the girl's hand. "I think you'd better go in and have your siesta. It's too hot for you here." "Very well, Teddy Bear. Are you coming too?" "When I've finished my cigar." "All right. But do hurry up and finish it, Teddy Bear." Slowly, reluctantly, she descended the steps of the terrace and walked towards the house. Mr. Hutton continued his contemplation of Florence. He had need to be alone. It was good sometimes to escape from Doris and the restless solicitude of her passion. He had never known the pains of loving hopelessly, but he was experiencing now the pains of being loved. These last weeks had been a period of growing discomfort. Doris was always with him, like an obsession, like a guilty conscience. Yes, it was good to be alone. He pulled an envelope out of his pocket and opened it, not without reluctance. He hated letters. They always contained something unpleasant nowadays, since his second marriage. This was from his sister. He began skimming through the insulting home truths of which it was composed. The words indecent haste, social suicide, scarcely cold in her grave, person of the lower classes, all occurred. They were inevitable now in any communication from a well-meaning and right-thinking relative. Impatient, he was about to tear the stupid letter to pieces, when his eye fell on a sentence at the bottom of the third page. His heart beat with uncomfortable violence as he read it. It was too monstrous. Janet Spence was going about telling everyone that he had poisoned his wife in order to marry Doris. What damnable malice! Ordinarily a man of the suavest temper, Mr. Hutton found himself trembling with rage. He took the childish satisfaction of calling names. He cursed the woman. Then suddenly he saw the ridiculous side of the situation. The notion that he should have murdered any one in order to marry Doris! If they only knew how miserably bored he was. Poor dear Janet! She had tried to be malicious. She had only succeeded in being stupid. A sound of footsteps aroused him. He looked round. In the garden below the little terrace, the servant girl of the house was picking fruit. A Neapolitan, strayed somehow as far north as Florence. She was a specimen of the classical type, a little debased. Her profile might have been taken from a Sicilian coin of a bad period. Her features, carved floridly in the grand tradition, expressed an almost perfect stupidity. Her mouth was the most beautiful thing about her. The calligraphic hand of nature had richly curved it into an expression of mulish bad temper. Under her hideous black clothes, Mr. Hutton divined a powerful body, firm and massive. He had looked at her before with a vague interest and curiosity. To-day the curiosity defined and focussed itself into a desire, an idyll of Theocritus. Here was the woman. He, alas, was not precisely like a goatherd on the volcanic hills. He called to her, "Armida!" The smile with which she answered him was so provocative, attested so easy a virtue, that Mr. Hutton took fright. He was on the brink once more, on the brink. He must draw back, oh, quickly, quickly, before it was too late. The girl continued to look up at him. "Acciamito?" she asked at last. Stupidity or reason? Oh, there was no choice now. It was imbecility every time. "Scendo," he called back to her. 12 steps led from the garden to the terrace. Mr. Hutton counted them. Down, 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 down. He saw a vision of himself descending from one circle of the inferno to the next, from a darkness full of wind and hail to an abyss of stinking mud. For a good many days the Hutton case had a place on the front page of every newspaper. There had been no more popular murder trial since George Smith had temporarily eclipsed the European war by drowning in a warm bath his seventh bride. The public imagination was stirred by this tale of a murder brought to light months after the date of the crime. Here, it was felt, was one of those incidents in human life, so notable because they are so rare, which do definitely justify the ways of God to man. A wicked man had been moved by an illicit passion to kill his wife. For months he had lived in sin and fancied security, only to be dashed at last more horribly into the pit he had prepared for himself. Murder will out, and here was a case of it. The readers of the newspapers were in a position to follow every movement of the hand of God. There had been vague but persistent rumours in the neighbourhood. The police had taken action at last. Then came the exhumation order, the post-mortem examination, the inquest, the evidence of the experts, the verdict of the coroner's jury, the trial, the condemnation. For once, Providence had done its duty, obviously, grossly, didactically, as in a melodrama. The newspapers were right in making of this case the staple intellectual food of a whole season. Mr. Hutton's first emotion, when he was summoned from Italy to give evidence at the inquest, was one of indignation. It was a monstrous, a scandalous thing that the police should take such idle, malicious gossip seriously. When the inquest was over, he would bring an action for malicious prosecution against the chief constable. He would sue the Spence woman for slander. The inquest was opened. The astonishing evidence unrolled itself. The experts had examined the body and had found traces of arsenic. They were of opinion that the late Mrs. Hutton had died of arsenic poisoning. Arsenic poisoning! Emily had died of arsenic poisoning? After that, Mr. Hutton learned with surprise that there was enough arsenicated insecticide in his greenhouses to poison an army. It was now, quite suddenly, that he saw it. There was a case against him. Fascinated, he watched it growing like some monstrous tropical plant. It was enveloping him, surrounding him. He was lost in a tangled forest. When was the poison administered? The experts agreed that it must have been swallowed 8 or 9 hours before death. About lunchtime? Yes, about lunchtime. Clara, the parlour-maid, was called. Mrs. Hutton, she remembered, had asked her to go and fetch her medicine. Mr. Hutton had volunteered to go instead. He had gone alone. Miss Spence? Ah, the memory of the storm, the white, aimed face, the horror of it all. Miss Spence confirmed Clara's statement, and added that Mr. Hutton had come back with the medicine already poured out in a wine-glass, not in the bottle. Mr. Hutton's indignation evaporated. He was dismayed, frightened. It was all too fantastic to be taken seriously. And yet this nightmare was a fact. It was actually happening. McNab had seen them kissing, often. He had taken them for a drive on the day of Mrs. Hutton's death. He could see them reflected in the wind-screen, sometimes out of the tail of his eye. The inquest was adjourned. That evening Doris went to bed with a headache. When he went to her room after dinner, Mr. Hutton found her crying. "What's the matter?" He sat down on the edge of her bed and began to stroke her hair. For a long time she did not answer, and he went on stroking her hair mechanically, almost unconsciously. Sometimes even he bent down and kissed her bare shoulder. He had his own affairs, however, to think about. What had happened? How was it that stupid gossip had actually come true? Emily had died of arsenic poisoning. It was absurd, impossible. The order of things had been broken, and he was at the mercy of an irresponsibility. What had happened? What was going to happen? He was interrupted in the midst of his thoughts. "It's my fault, it's my fault," Doris suddenly sobbed out. "I shouldn't have loved you. I oughtn't to have let you love me. Why was I ever born?" Mr. Hutton didn't say anything, but looked down in silence at the abject figure of Misery lying on the bed. "If they do anything to you, I shall kill myself." She sat up, held him for a moment at arm's length, and looked at him with a kind of violence, as though she were never to see him again. "I love you, I love you, I love you." She drew him, inert and passive, towards her, clasped him, pressed herself against him. "I didn't know you loved me as much as that, Teddy bear. But why did you do it? Why did you do it?" Mr. Hutton undid her clasping arms and got up. His face became very red. "You seem to take it for granted that I murdered my wife," he said. "It's really too grotesque. What do you all take me for? A cinema hero?" He had begun to lose his temper. All the exasperation, all the fear and bewilderment of the day was transformed into a violent anger against her. "It's all such damned stupidity. Haven't you any conception of a civilized man's mentality? Do I look the sort of man who'd go about slaughtering people? I suppose you imagined I was so insanely in love with you that I could commit any folly. When will you women understand that one isn't insanely in love? All one asks for is a quiet life, which you won't allow one to have. I don't know what the devil ever induced me to marry you. It was all a damned stupid practical joke. And now you go about saying I'm a murderer. I won't stand it." Mr. Hutton stamped towards the door. He had said horrible things, he knew, odious things that he ought speedily to unsay. But he wouldn't. He closed the door behind him. "Teddy bear." He turned the handle. The latch clicked into place. "Teddy bear." The voice that came to him through the closed door was agonized. Should he go back? He ought to go back. He touched the handle, then withdrew his fingers and quickly walked away. When he was halfway down the stairs, he halted. She might try to do something silly, throw herself out of the window, or God knows what. He listened attentively. There was no sound. But he pictured her very clearly, tiptoeing across the room, lifting the sash as high as it would go, leaning out into the cold night air. It was raining a little. Under the window lay the paved terrace. How far below? 25 or 30 feet? Once, when he was walking along Piccadilly, a dog had jumped out of a third-story window of the Ritz. He had seen it fall. He had heard it strike the pavement. Shouldn't he go back? He was damned if he would. He hated her. He sat for a long time in the library. What had happened? What was happening? He turned the question over and over in his mind and could find no answer. Suppose the nightmare dreamed itself out to its horrible conclusion. Death was waiting for him. His eyes filled with tears. He wanted so passionately to live, just to be alive. Poor Emily had wished it too, he remembered, just to be alive. There were so many places in this astonishing world unvisited, So many queer, delightful people still unknown. So many lovely women never so much as seen. The huge white oxen would still be dragging their wains along the Tuscan roads. The cypresses would still go up straight as pillars to the blue heaven. But he would not be there to see them. And the sweet southern wines, tear of Christ and blood of Judas, others would drink them, not he. Others would walk down the obscure and narrow lanes between the bookshelves in the London Library, sniffing the dusty perfume of good literature, peering at strange titles, discovering unknown names, exploring the fringes of vast domains of knowledge. He would be lying in a hole in the ground. And why? Why? Confusedly, he felt that some extraordinary kind of justice was being done. In the past, he had been wanton and imbecile and irresponsible. Now, fate was playing as wantonly, as irresponsibly with him. It was tit for tat, and God existed after all. He felt that he would like to pray. 40 years ago he used to kneel by his bed every evening. The nightly formula of his childhood came to him, almost unsought, from some long unopened chamber of the memory. God bless father and mother, Tom and Cissy and the baby, Mam'selle and nurse and everyone that I love, and make me a good boy, amen. They were all dead now, except Cissy. His mind seemed to soften and dissolve. A great calm descended upon his spirit. He went upstairs to ask Doris's forgiveness. He found her lying on the couch at the foot of her bed. On the floor beside her stood a blue bottle of liniment marked "Not to be taken." She seemed to have drunk about half of it. "You didn't love me," was all she said when she opened her eyes to find him bending over her. Dr. Libbard arrived in time to prevent any very serious consequences. "You mustn't do this again," he said when Mr. Hutton was out of the room. "What's to prevent me?" she asked defiantly. Dr. Libbard looked at her with his large, sad eyes. "There's nothing to prevent you," he said. "Only yourself and your baby. Isn't it rather bad luck on your baby, not allowing it to come into the world because you want to go out of it?" Doris was silent for a time. "All right," she whispered. "I won't." Mr. Hutton sat by her bedside for the rest of the night. He felt himself now to be indeed a murderer. For a time he persuaded himself that he loved this pitiable child. Dozing in his chair, he woke up stiff and cold, to find himself drained dry, as it were, of every emotion. He had become nothing but a tired and suffering carcass. At 6 o'clock he undressed and went to bed for a couple hours' sleep. In the course of the same afternoon, the coroner's jury brought in a verdict of wilful murder, and Mr. Hutton was committed for trial. Miss Spence was not at all well. She had found her public appearances in the witness box very trying, and when it was all over she had something that was very nearly a breakdown. She slept badly, and suffered from nervous indigestion. Dr. Libbard used to call every other day. She talked to him a great deal, mostly about the Hutton case. Her moral indignation was always on the boil. Wasn't it appalling to think that one had had a murderer in one's house? Wasn't it extraordinary that one could have been for so long mistaken about the man's character? But she had had an inkling from the first. And then the girl he'd gone off with, so low class, so little better than a prostitute. The news that the second Mrs. Hutton was expecting a baby, the posthumous child of a condemned and executed criminal, revolted her. The thing was shocking, an obscenity. Dr. Libbard answered her gently and vaguely, and prescribed bromide. One morning he interrupted her in the midst of her customary tirade. "By the way," he said in his soft, melancholy voice, "I suppose it was really you who poisoned Mrs. Hutton?" Miss Spence stared at him for 2 or 3 seconds with enormous eyes, and then quietly said, "Yes." After that she started to cry. "In the coffee, I suppose?" She seemed to nod assent. Dr. Libbard took out his fountain pen, and, in his neat, meticulous caligraphy, wrote out a prescription for a sleeping draught. End of chapter 1. Permutations among the Nightingales. A play. It is night on the terrace outside the Hotel Cimarosa. Part of the garden facade of the hotel is seen at the back of the stage. A bare white wall, with 3 French windows giving on 2 balconies, about 10 feet from the ground, and below them, leading from the terrace to the lounge, a double door of glass, open now, through which a yellow radiance streams out into the night. On the paved terrace stand 2 or 3 green iron tables and chairs. To the left, a mass of dark foliage, ilex and cypress, in the shadow of which more tables and chairs are set. At the back, to the left, a strip of sky is visible between the corner of the hotel and the dark trees, blue and starry, for it is a marvellous June evening. Behind the trees the ground slopes steeply down and down to an old city in the valley below, of whose invisible presence you are made aware by the sound of many bells wafted up from a score of slender towers in a sweet and melancholy discord that seems to mourn the passing of each successive hour. When the curtain rises, the terrace is almost deserted. The hotel dinner is not yet over. A single guest, Count Alberto Tiretta, is discovered sitting in a position of histrionic despair at one of the little green tables. A waiter stands, respectfully sympathetic, at his side. Alberto is a little man, with large, lustrous eyes and a black moustache, about 25 years of age. He has the pathetic charm of an Italian street boy with an organ, almost as pretty and sentimental as Murillo's little beggars. Alberto, making a florid gesture with his right hand, and with his left covering his eyes, whereupon, waiter, he is reciting a tale of woes, she slammed the door in my face. He brings down his gesticulating right hand with a crash onto the table. Waiter. In your face, signore. Impossible. Alberto. Impossible, but a fact. Some more brandy, please. I am a little weary. The waiter uncorks the bottle he has been holding under his arm and fills Alberto's glass. Waiter. That will be 1 lira 25, signore. Alberto, throwing down a note. Keep the change. Waiter, bowing. Thank you, signore. But if I were the signore, I should beat her. He holds up the cognac bottle, and, by way of illustration, slaps its black polished flanks. Alberto. Beat her? But I tell you, I am in love with her. Waiter. All more reason, then, signore. It will not only be a stern disciplinary duty, but a pleasure as well. Oh, I assure you, signore, a pleasure. Alberto. Enough, enough. You sully the melancholy beauty of my thoughts. My feelings at this moment are of an unheard-of delicacy and purity. Respect them, I beg you. Some more brandy, please. Waiter, pouring out the brandy. Delicacy, purity? Ah, believe me, signore, that will be 1 lira 25. Alberto, throwing down another note with the same superbly aristocratic gesture. Keep the change. Waiter. Thank you, signore. But as I was saying, signore, delicacy, purity, you think I do not understand such sentiments. Alas, signore, beneath the humblest shirt front there beats a heart. And if the signore's sentiments are too much for him, I have a niece, 18 years old. And what eyes, what forms! Alberto. Stop, stop. Respect my feelings, waiter, as well as the ears of the young lady. He points towards the glass doors. Remember, she is an American. The waiter bows and goes into the hotel. Sidney Dolphin and Miss Amy Toomis come out together onto the terrace. Miss Amy supports a well-shaped head on one of the most graceful necks that ever issued from Minneapolis. The eyes are dark, limpid, ingenuous. The mouth expresses sensibility. She is 22, and the heiress of those ill-gotten Toomis millions. Sidney Dolphin has a romantic aristocratic appearance. The tailoring of 1830 would suit him. Balzac would have described his face as plein de poésie. In effect, he does happen to be a poet. His 2 volumes of verse, Zoetrope and Trembling Ears, have been recognized by intelligent critics as remarkable. How far they are poetry, nobody, least of all Dolphin himself, is certain. They may be merely the ingenious product of a very cultured and elaborate brain. Mere curiosities. Who knows? His age is 27. They sit down at one of the little iron tables. Alberto they do not see. The shadow of the trees conceals him. For his part, he is too much absorbed in savouring his own despair to pay any attention to the newcomers. There is a long, uncomfortable silence. Dolphin assumes the thinker's mask, the bent brow, the frown, the finger to the forehead. Amy regards this romantic gargoyle with some astonishment. Pleased with her interest in him, Dolphin racks his brains to think of some way of exploiting this curiosity to his own advantage. But he is too shy to play any of the gambits which his ingenuity suggests. Amy makes a social effort and speaks in chanting Middle Western tones. Amy. It's been a wonderful day, hasn't it? Dolphin, starting as though roused from profoundest thought. Yes, it has. Amy. You don't often get it as fine as this in England, I guess. Dolphin. Not often. Amy. Nor do we over at home. Dolphin. So I should suppose. Silence. A spasm of anguish crosses Dolphin's face. Then he reassumes the old thinker's mask. Amy looks at him for a little longer, then, unable to suppress her growing curiosity, she says, with a sudden burst of childish confidence, Amy. It must be wonderful to be able to think as hard as you do, Mr. Dolphin. Or are you sad about something? Dolphin looks up, smiles, and blushes. A spell has been broken. The finger at the temple, Miss Toomis, is not the barrel of a revolver. Amy. That means you're not specially sad about anything. Just thinking? Dolphin. Just thinking. Amy. What about? Dolphin. Oh, just life, you know. Life and letters. Amy. Letters? Do you mean love letters? Dolphin. No. Letters in the sense of literature. Letters as opposed to life. Amy. Disappointed. Oh, literature. They used to teach us literature at school, but I could never understand Emerson. What do you think about literature for? Dolphin. It interests me, you know. I read it. I even try to write it. Amy. very much excited. What, are you a writer? A poet, Mr. Dolphin? Dolphin. Alas, it is only too true. I am. Amy. But what do you write? Dolphin. Verse and prose, Miss Toomis. Just verse and prose. Amy, with enthusiasm. Isn't that interesting? I've never met a poet before, you know. Dolphin. Fortunate being. Why, before I left England, I attended a luncheon party of the Poetry Union at which no less than 189 poets were present. The sight of them made me decide to go to Italy. Amy. Will you show me your books? Dolphin. Certainly not, Miss Toomis. That would ruin our friendship. I am insufferable in my writings. In them I give vent to all the horrible thoughts and impulses which I am too timid to express or put into practice in real life. Take me as you find me here, a decent specimen of a man, shy, but able to talk intelligently when the layers of ice are broken, aimless, ineffective, but, on the whole, quite a good sort. Amy. But I know that man already, Mr. Dolphin. I want to know the poet. Tell me what the poet is like. Dolphin. He is older, Miss Toomis, than the rocks on which he sits. He is villainous. He is... But there, I really must stop. It was you who set me going, though. Did you do it on purpose? Amy. Do what on purpose? Dolphin. Make me talk about myself? If you want to get people to like you, you must always lead the conversation on to the subject of their characters. Nothing pleases them so much. They'll talk with enthusiasm for hours, and go away saying that you're the most charming, cleverest person they've ever met. But, of course, you knew that already. You're Machiavellian. Amy. Machiavellian? You're the first person that's ever said that. I always thought I was very simple and straightforward. People say about me that... now I'm talking about myself. That was unscrupulous of you. But you shouldn't have told me about the trick if you wanted it to succeed. Dolphin. Yes, it was silly of me. If I hadn't, you'd have gone on talking about yourself, and thought me the nicest man in the world. Amy. I want to hear about your poetry. Are you writing any now? Dolphin. I have composed the first line of a magnificent epic, but I can't get any further. Amy. How does it go? Dolphin. Like this. He clears his throat. Casbin has been, and Moghreb is no more. Ah, the transience of all sublunary things. But inspiration has stopped short there. Amy. What exactly does it mean? Dolphin. There you're asking too much, Miss Toomis. Waiter, some coffee for two? Waiter, who is standing in the door of the lounge. Si, signore. Will the lady and gentleman take it here, or in the gardens, perhaps? Dolphin. A good suggestion. Why shouldn't the lady and gentleman take it in the garden? Amy. Why not? Dolphin. By the fountain, then, waiter. We can talk about ourselves there, to the tune of falling waters. Amy. And you shall recite your poetry, Mr. Dolphin. I just love poetry. Do you know Mrs. Wilcox's Poems of Passion? They go out to the left. A nightingale utters 2 or 3 phrases of song, and from far down the bells of the city jangle the 3 quarters and die slowly away into the silence out of which they rose and came together. Lucrezia Grattarol has just come out of the hotel in time to overhear Miss Toomis's last remark, just in time to see her walk slowly away with a hand on Sidney Dolphin's arm. Lucrezia has a fine, thoroughbred appearance, an aquiline nose, a finely curved, sensual mouth, a superb white brow, a quivering nostril. She is the last of a family whose name is as illustrious in Venetian annals as that of Foscarini, Tiepolo, or Tron. She stamps a preposterously high-heeled foot and tosses her head. Lucrezia. Passion, indeed! An American! She starts to run after the retreating couple, when Alberto, who has been sitting with his head between his hands, looks up and catches sight of the newcomer. Alberto. Lucrezia! Lucrezia starts, for in the shade beneath the trees she had not seen him. Oh, you gave me such a fright, Alberto. I'm in a hurry now. Later on, if you... Alberto, in a desperate voice that breaks into a sob. Lucrezia, you must come and talk to me. You must. Lucrezia. But I tell you I can't now, Alberto. Later on. Alberto, the tears streaming down his cheeks. Now, you must come now. I am lost if you don't. Lucrezia, looking indecisively first at Alberto, and then along the path down which Amy and Sidney Dolphin have disappeared. But supposing I am lost if I do come? Alberto. But you couldn't be as much lost as I am. Ah, you don't know what it is to suffer. Nur wer die Sehnsucht kennt, weiß, was ich leide. Oh, Lucrezia! He sobs unrestrainedly. Lucrezia goes over to where Alberto is sitting, pats his shoulder and his bowed head of black curly hair. There, my little Bertino. Tell me what it is. You mustn't cry. There. Alberto, drying his eyes and rubbing his head like a cat avid of caresses against her hand. How can I thank you enough, Lucrezia? You are like a mother to me. Lucrezia. I know. That's just what's so dangerous. Alberto lets his head fall upon her bosom. I come to you for comfort, like a tired child, Lucrezia. Lucrezia. Poor darling. She strokes his hair, twines its thick black tendrils round her fingers. Alberto is abjectly pathetic. Alberto, with closed eyes and a seraphic smile. Ah, the suavity, the beauty of this maternal instinct. Lucrezia, with a sudden access of energy and passion. The disgustingness of it, you mean? She pushes him from her. His head wobbles once, as though it were inanimate, before he straightens into life. The maternal instinct. Ugh! It's been the undoing of too many women. You men come with your sentimental babyishness and exploit it for your own lusts. Be a man, Bertino. Be a woman, I mean, if you can. Alberto, looking up at her with eyes full of dog-like dumb reproach. Lucrezia, you too? Is there nobody who cares for me? This is the unkindest cut of all. I may as well die. He relapses into tears. Lucrezia, who has started to go, turns back, irresolute. Now don't cry, Bertino. Can't you behave like a reasonable being? She makes as though to go again. Alberto, through his sobs. You too, Lucrezia. Oh, I can't bear it. I can't bear it. Lucrezia, turning back desperately. But what do you want me to do? Why should you expect me to hold your hand? Alberto. I thought better of you, Lucrezia. Let me go. There is nothing left for me now but death. He rises to his feet, takes a step or two, and then collapses into another chair, unable to move. Lucrezia, torn between anger and remorse. Now do behave yourself sensibly, Bertino. There, you mustn't cry. I'm sorry if I've hurt you. Looking towards the left, along the path taken by Amy and Dolphin. Oh, damnation! She stamps her foot. Here, Bertino, do pull yourself together. She raises him up. There, now, you must stop crying. But as soon as she lets go of him, his head falls back onto the iron table with an unpleasant, meaty bump. The bump is too much for Lucrezia. She bends over him, strokes his head, even kisses the lustrous curls. Lucrezia. Oh, forgive me, forgive me. I have been a beast. But tell me first, what's the matter, Bertino? What is it, my poor darling? Tell me. Alberto. Nobody loves me. Lucrezia. But we are all devoted to you, Bertino mio. Alberto. She isn't. Today she shut the door in my face. Lucrezia. She? You mean the Frenchwoman, the one you told me about? Louise, wasn't she? Alberto. Yes, the one with the golden hair. Lucrezia. And the white legs. I remember you saw her bathing. Alberto lays his hand on his heart. Ah, don't remind me of it. His face twitches convulsively. Lucrezia. And now she's gone and shut the door in your face. Alberto. In my face, Lucrezia. Lucrezia. Poor darling. Alberto. For me, there is nothing now but the outer darkness. Lucrezia. Is the door shut forever, then? Alberto. Definitively, forever. Lucrezia. But have you tried knocking? Perhaps, after all, it might be opened again, if only a crack. Alberto. What? Bruise my hands against the granite of her heart? Lucrezia. Don't be too poetical, Bertino mio. Why not try again in any case? Alberto. You give me courage. Lucrezia. There's no harm in trying, you know. Alberto. Courage to live, to conquer. He beats his breast. I am a man again, thanks to you, Lucrezia, my inspirer, my muse, my Egeria. How can I be sufficiently grateful? He kisses her. I am the child of your spirit. He kisses her again. Lucrezia. Enough, enough. I am not ambitious to be a mother yet awhile. Quickly now, Bertino. I know you will succeed. Alberto, cramming his hat down on his head and knocking with his walking stick on the ground. Succeed or die, Lucrezia. He goes out with a loud martial stamp. Lucrezia, to the waiter who is passing across the stage with a coffee pot and cups on a tray. Have you seen the Signorina too, Miss Giuseppe? Waiter. The Signorina is down in the garden. So is the Signore Dolphin. By the fountain, Signorina. This is the Signore's coffee. Lucrezia. Have you a mother, Giuseppe? Waiter. Unfortunately, Signorina. Lucrezia. Unfortunately, does she treat you badly, then? Waiter. Like a dog, Signorina. Lucrezia. Ah, I should like to see your mother. I should like to ask her to give me some hints on how to bring up children. Waiter. But surely, Signorina, you are not expecting Lucrezia. Only figuratively, Giuseppe. My children are spiritual children. Waiter. Precisely, precisely. My mother, alas, is not a spiritual relation, nor is my fiancé. Lucrezia. I didn't know you were engaged. Waiter. To an angel of perdition. Believe me, Signorina, I go to my destruction in that woman, go with open eyes. There is no escape. She is what is called in the Holy Bible, crosses himself, a fisher of men. Lucrezia. You have remarkable connections, Giuseppe. Waiter. I am honored by your words, Signorina, but the coffee becomes cold. He hurries out to the left. Lucrezia. In the garden, by the fountain. And there's the nightingale beginning to sing in earnest. Good heavens, what may not already have happened? She runs out after the waiter. Two persons emerge from the hotel, the Vicomte de Barbazange and the Baroness Coeur de Worms. Paul de Barbazange is a young man, 26 perhaps, of exquisite grace, 5'10", well built, dark hair, sleek as marble, the most refined aristocratic features, and a monocle. Simone de Worms is 40. 5 years more, and the bursting point of over-ripeness will have been reached. But now, thanks to massage, powerful corsets, skin foods, and powder, she is still a beauty. A beauty of the type Italians admire, cushioned, steatopagus. Paul, who has a faultless taste in bric-a-brac and women, and is by instinct and upbringing an ardent anti-Semite, finds her infinitely repulsive. The Baronne enters with a loud, shrill giggle. She gives Paul a slap with her green feather fan. Simon. "Oh, you naughty boy! Quelle histoire, mon Dieu! How dare you tell me such a story?" Paul. "For you, Baron, I would risk anything, even your displeasure." Simon. "Charming boy! What stories of that kind? And you look so innocent, too. Do you know any more like it?" Paul, suddenly grave. "Not of that description, but I will tell you a story of another kind. A true story, a tragic story." Simon. "Did I ever tell you how I saw a woman run over by a train? Cut to pieces, literally to pieces. So disagreeable. I'll tell you later. But now, what about your story?" Paul. "Oh, it's nothing, nothing." Simon. "But you promised to tell it me." Paul. "It's only a commonplace anecdote. A young man, poor but noble, with a name and a position to keep up, a few youthful follies, a mountain of debts, and no way out except the revolver. This is all dull and obvious enough, but now follows the interesting part of the story. He is about to take the way out, when he meets the woman of his dreams, the goddess, the angel, the ideal. He loves, and he must die without a word. He turns his face away from the Baron, as though his emotion were too much for him, which, indeed, it is. Simon. Vicomte. Paul. This young man is you? Paul, solemnly. He is. Simon. And the woman? Paul. Oh, I can't. I mayn't tell you. Simon. The woman? Tell me, Paul. Paul, turning towards her and falling on his knees. The woman, Simon, is you, but I had no right to say it. Simon, quivering with emotion. My Paul! She clasps his head to her bosom. A grimace of disgust contorts Paul's classical features. He endures Simon's caresses with a stoical patience. Simon. But what is this about a revolver? That is only a joke, Paul, isn't it? Say it isn't true. Paul. Alas, Simon, too true. He taps his coat pocket. There it lies. Tomorrow I have 170,000 francs to pay, or be dishonoured. I cannot pay the sum. A Barbazange does not survive dishonour. My ancestors were crusaders, preux chevaliers to a man. Their code is mine. Dishonour for me is worse than death. Simon. Mon Dieu, Paul, how noble you are! She lays her hands on his shoulder, leans back, and surveys him at arm's length, a look of pride and anxious happiness on her face. Paul, dropping his eyes modestly. Not at all. I was born noble, and noblesse oblige, as we say in our family. Farewell, Simon. I love you, and I must die. My last thought will be of you. He kisses her hand, rises to his feet, and makes as though to go. Simon, clutching him by the arm. "No, Paul, no, you must not, shall not do anything rash. 170,000 francs, did you say? It is paltry. Is there no one who could lend or give you the money?" "Paul, not a soul. Farewell, Simon." "Simon." "Stay, Paul. I hardly dare ask it of you, you with such lofty ideas of honour, but would you, from me—" "Paul." "Take money from a woman? Ah, Simon, tempt me no more. I might do an ignoble act." "Simon." "But from me, Paul, from me? I am not, in your eyes, a woman like any other woman, am I?" "Paul." "It is true that my ancestors, the Crusaders, the Preux-Chevaliers, might, in all honour, receive gifts from the ladies of their choice, chargers, swords, armour, or tender mementos, such as gloves or garters. But money, no. Who ever heard of their taking money?" "Simon." "But what would be the use of my giving you swords and horses? You could never use them. Consider, my knight, my noble Sir Paul. In these days the contests of chivalry have assumed a different form. The weapons and the armour have changed. Your sword must be of gold and paper, your breastplate of hard cash, your charger of gilt-edged securities. I offer you the shining panoply of the modern crusader. Will you accept it?" "Paul." "You are eloquent, Simon. You could win over the devil himself with that angelic voice of yours. But it cannot be. Money is always money. The code is clear. I cannot accept your offer. Here is the way out." He takes an automatic pistol out of his pocket. "Thank you, Simon. And goodbye. How wonderful is the love of a pure woman." "Simon." "Paul, Paul, give that to me." She snatches the pistol from his hand. "If anything were to happen to you, Paul, I should kill myself with this. You must live. You must consent to accept the money. You mustn't let your honour make a martyr of you." Paul, brushing a tear from his eyes. "No, I can't. Give me that pistol, I beg you." Simon. "For my sake, Paul." Paul. "Oh, you make it impossible for me to act as the voices of dead ancestors tell me I should. For your sake, then, Simon, I consent to live. For your sake, I dare to accept the gift you offer." Simon, kissing his hand in an outburst of gratitude. Thank you, Paul. How happy I am." Paul. "I, too, light of my life." Simon. "My month's allowance arrived today. I have the cheque here." She takes it out of her corsage. 200,000 francs. It's already signed. You can get it cashed as soon as the banks open tomorrow." Paul, moved by an outburst of genuine emotion, kisses indiscriminately the cheque, the Baron, his own hands. "My angel, you have saved me. How can I thank you? How can I love you enough? Ah, mon petit bouton de rose." Simon. "Oh, naughty, naughty! Not now, my Paul. You must wait till some other time." Paul. "I burn with impatience." Simon. "Quelle fougue! Listen, then. In an hour's time, Paul, chéri, in my boudoir. I shall be alone." Paul. "An hour! It is an eternity." Simon, playfully. "An hour. I won't relent till then, my Paul." She blows a kiss and runs out. The scenery trembles at her passage. Paul looks at the cheque, then pulls out a large silk handkerchief and wipes his neck inside his collar. Dolphin drifts in from the left. He is smoking a cigarette, but he does not seem to be enjoying it. Paul. Alone? Dolphin. Alas. Paul. Brooding on the universe, as usual? I envy you your philosophic detachment. Personally, I find the world is very much too much with us, and the devil too. He looks at the cheque in his hand. And above all, the flesh. My God, the flesh. He wipes his neck again. Dolphin. My philosophic detachment? But it's only a mask to hide the ineffectual longings I have to achieve contact with the world. Paul. But surely nothing is easier. One just makes a movement and impinges on one's fellow beings. Dolphin. Not with a temperament like mine. Imagine a shyness more powerful than curiosity or desire, a paralysis of all the faculties. You are a man of the world. You were born with a forehead of brass to affront every social emergency. Ah, if you knew what a torture it is to find yourself in the presence of someone, a woman, perhaps, someone in whom you take an interest that is not merely philosophic, to find oneself in the presence of such a person, and to be incapable, yes, physically incapable, of saying a word to express your interest in her, or your desire to possess her intimacy. Ah, I notice I have slipped into the feminine, inevitably, for, of course, the person is always a she. Paul. Of course, that goes without saying. But what's the trouble? Women are so simple to deal with. Dolphin. I know, perfectly simple, if one's in the right state of mind. I have found that out myself, for moments come, alas, how rarely, when I am filled with the spirit of confidence, possessed by some angel or devil of power. Ah, then I feel myself to be superb. I carry all before me. In those brief moments, the whole secret of the world is revealed to me. I perceive that the supreme quality in the human soul is effrontery. Genius in the man of action is simply the apotheosis of charlatanism. Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Mr. Gladstone, Lloyd George, what are they? Just ordinary human beings, projected through the magic lantern of a prodigious effrontery, and so magnified to 1,000 times larger than life. Look at me. I am far more intelligent than any of these fabulous figures. My sensibility is more refined than theirs. I am morally superior to any of them. And yet, by my lack of charlatanism, I am made less than nothing. My qualities are projected through the wrong end of a telescope, and the world perceives me far smaller than I really am. But the world! Who cares about the world? The only people who matter are the women. Paul. Very true, my dear Dolphin. The women. He looks at the cheque, and mops himself once more with his mauve silk handkerchief. Dolphin. To-night was one of my moments of triumph. I felt myself suddenly free of all my inhibitions. Paul. I hope you profited by the auspicious occasion. Dolphin. I did. I was making headway. I had... But I don't know why I should bore you with my confidences. Curious that one should be dumb before intimates, and open one's mind to an all but stranger. I must apologize. Paul. But I am all attention and sympathy, my dear Dolphin. And I take it a little hardly that you should regard me as a stranger. He lays a hand on Dolphin's shoulder. Dolphin. Thank you, Barbazange, thank you. Well, if you consent to be the receptacle of my woes, I shall go on pouring them out. Miss Toomis. But tell me frankly what you think of her. Paul. Well? Dolphin. A little too ingenuous? A little silly even, eh? Paul. Now you say so, she certainly isn't very intellectually stimulating. Dolphin. Precisely. But, oh, those china blue eyes, that ingenuousness, that pathetic and enchanting silliness. She touches lost chords in one's heart. I love the chromatic fantasia of Bach. I am transported by Beethoven's 111th Sonata, but the fact doesn't prevent my being moved to tears by the last luscious waltz played by the hotel orchestra. In the best constructed brains there are always spongy surfaces that are sensitive to picture postcards and Little Nelly and The End of a Perfect Day. Miss Toomis has found my Achilles heel. She is boring, ridiculous, absurd to a degree, but oh, how moving, how adorable. Paul. You're done for, my poor Dolphin. Sunk, spurlos. Dolphin. And I was getting on so well, was revelling in my new-found confidence, and, knowing its transience, was exploiting it for all I was worth. I had covered an enormous amount of ground, and then, hey, presto, at a blow all my labours were undone. Actuated by what malice I don't know, La Lucrezia swoops down like a vulture, and, without a by your leave or excuse of any kind, carries off Miss Toomis from under my very eyes. What a woman! She terrifies me. I am always running away from her. Paul. Which means, I suppose, that she is always pursuing you? Dolphin. She has ruined my evening, and, it may be, all my chances of success. My precious hour of self-confidence will be wasted, though I hope you'll not take offence at the word wasted on you. Paul. It will return. Dolphin. But when? When? Till it does, I shall be impotent and in agony. Paul. I know the agony of waiting. I myself was engaged to a Romanian princess in 1916, but owing to the sad collapse of the Romanian rate of exchange, I have had to postpone our union indefinitely. It is painful, but believe me, it can be borne. He looks at the cheque and then at his watch. There are other things which are much worse. Believe me, Dolphin, it can be borne. Dolphin. I suppose it can. For when all is said, there are damned few of us who really take things much to heart. Julie de l'Espinasse are happily not common. I am even subnormal. At 20 I believed myself passionate. One does at that age. But now, when I come to consider myself candidly, I find that I am really one of those who never deeply felt, nor strongly willed. Everything is profoundly indifferent to me. I sometimes try to depress myself with the thought that the world is a cesspool, that men are pathetic degenerates from the ape, whose laboriously manufactured ideals are pure nonsense, and find no rhyme in reality, that the whole of life is a bad joke which takes a long time coming to an end. But it really doesn't upset me. I don't care a curse. It's deplorable. One ought to care. The best people do care. Still, I must say, I should like to get possession of Miss Toomis. Confound that Grattarol woman! What on earth did she want to rush me like that for, do you suppose? Paul. I expect we shall find out now. Paul jerks his head towards the left. Lucrezia and Amy are seen entering from the garden. Lucrezia holds her companion's arm and marches with a firm step towards the two men. Amy suffers herself to be dragged along. Lucrezia. Vicomte, Miss Toomis wants you to tell her all about Correggio. Amy, rather scared. Oh, really? Lucrezia. And, sternly, and Michelangelo. She is so much interested in art. Amy. But please don't trouble. Paul, bowing gracefully. I shall be delighted, and in return I hope Miss Dumas will tell me all about Longfellow. Amy, brightening. Oh, yes. Don't you just love Evangeline? Paul. I do. And with your help, Miss Dumas, I hope I shall learn to love her better. Lucrezia, to Dolphin, who has been looking from Amy to the Vicomte, and back again at Amy, with eyes that betray a certain disquietude. You really must come and look at the moon rising over the hills, Mr. Dolphin. One sees it best from the lower terrace. Shall we go? Dolphin starts and shrinks. But it's rather cold, isn't it? I mean, I think I ought to go write a letter. Lucrezia. Oh, you can do that tomorrow. Dolphin. But really, Lucrezia, you've no idea how lovely the moon looks. Dolphin. But I must. Lucrezia lays her hand on his sleeve. The moon, the moon. Paul and Amy regard their exit in silence. Paul. He doesn't look as though he much wanted to go see the moon. Amy. Perhaps he guesses what's in store for him. Paul, surprised. What? You don't mean to say you realized it all this time? Amy. Realized what? Paul. About La Belle Lucrezia. Amy. I don't know what you mean. All I know is that she means to give Mr. Dolphin a good talking to. He's so mercenary. Made me quite indignant when she told me about him. Such a schemer, too. You know, in America we have a very definite idea about honour. Paul. Here too, Miss Dumas. Amy. Not Mr. Dolphin. Oh, dear. It made me so sad. More sad than angry. I can never be grateful enough to Signorina Grattarol. Paul. But I'm still at a loss to know exactly what you're talking about. Amy. And I am quite bewildered myself. Would you have believed it of him? I thought him such a nice man. Paul. What has he done? Amy. It's all for my money. Miss Grattarol told me. She knows. He was just asking me to marry him, and I believe I would have said yes, but she came in just in the nick of time. It seems he only wanted to marry me because I'm so rich. He doesn't care for me at all. Miss Grattarol knows what he's like. It's awful, isn't it? Oh, dear, I wouldn't have thought it of him. Paul. But you must forgive him, Miss Dumas. Money is a great temptation. Perhaps if you gave him another chance. Amy. Impossible. Paul. Poor Dolphin. He's such a nice young fellow. Amy. I thought so too. But he's false. Paul. Don't be too hard on him. Money probably means too much to him. It's the fault of his upbringing. No one who has not lived among the traditions of our ancient aristocracy can be expected to have that contempt, almost that hatred of wealth, which is the sign of true nobility. If he had been brought up, as I was, in an old maculated castle on the Loire, surrounded by ancestral ghosts, imbued with the spirit of the Crusaders and preux chevaliers who had inhabited the place in the past, if he had learnt to know what noblesse oblige really means, believe me, Miss Dumas, he could never have done such a thing. Amy. I should just think he couldn't, Monsieur Barbazange. Paul. You have no idea, Miss Dumas, how difficult it is for a man of truly noble feelings to get over the fact of your great wealth. When I heard that you were the possessor of $100 billion, Amy. Oh, I'm afraid it's more than that. It's 200 million. Paul. Of $200 million, then. It only makes it worse. I was very melancholy, Miss Toomis, for those $200 million were a barrier which a descendant of the Crusaders and the Preux-Chevalier could never overleap. Honor, Miss Toomis, honor forbade. Ah, if only that accursed money had not stood in the way. When I first saw you, oh, how I was moved by that vision of beauty and innocence. I wanted nothing better than to stand gazing on you forever. But then I heard about those millions. Dolphin was lucky to have felt no restraints. But enough, enough. He checks a rising tide of emotion. Give poor Dolphin another chance, Miss Toomis. At bottom, he is a good fellow, and he may learn in time to esteem you for your own sake, and to forget the dazzling millions. Amy. Never. I can only marry a man who is entirely disinterested. Paul. But can't you see, no disinterested man could ever bring himself to ask you. How could he prove his disinterestedness? No one would believe the purity of his intentions. Amy, much moved. It is for me to judge. I know a disinterested man when I see him. Even in America we can understand honor. Paul, with a sob in his voice. Goodbye, Miss Toomis. Amy. But no, I don't want it to be goodbye. Paul. It must be. Never shall it be said of a Barbazange that he hunted a woman for her money. Amy. But what does it matter what the world says, if I say the opposite? Paul. You say the opposite? Thank you, but no, goodbye. Amy. Stop! Oh, you're forcing me to do a most unwomanly thing. You're making me ask you to marry me. You're the only disinterested man I've ever met, or, to judge from what I've seen of the world, I'm ever likely to meet. Haven't you kept away from me in spite of your feelings? Haven't you even tried to make me listen to another man? A man not worthy to black your boots? Oh, it's so wonderful, so noble. It's like something in a picture play. Paul, I offer myself to you. Will you take me in spite of my millions? Paul, falling on his knees and kissing the hem of Amy's skirt. My angel, you're right. What does it matter what the world says, as long as you believe in me? Amy, bien-aimée. Ah, it's too good to be true. He rises to his feet and embraces her with an unfeigned enthusiasm. Amy. Paul, and so this is love. It's wonderful, isn't it? Paul, looking round anxiously. You mustn't tell anyone about our engagement, Amy. They might say unpleasant things in the hotel, you know. Amy. Of course I won't talk about it. We'll keep our happiness to ourselves, won't we? Paul. Entirely to ourselves. And tomorrow we'll go to Paris and arrange about being married. Amy. Yes. We'll take the 8 o'clock train. Paul. Not the 8 o'clock, my darling. I have to go to the bank tomorrow to do a little business. We must wait till the 12:30. Amy. Very well, then, at 12:30. Oh, how happy I am. Paul. So am I, my sweetheart. More than I can tell you. The sound of a window being opened is heard. They look up and see the Baroness, dressed in a peignoir of the tenderest blue, emerging on to the right hand of the 3 balconies. Amy. Oh, my soul! I think I'd better go in. Good night, my Paul. She runs in. Simone. Has that horrid little American girl gone? She peers down, then, reassured, she blows a kiss to Paul. My Romeo! Paul. I come, Juliet. Simon. There's a kiss for you. Paul, throwing kisses with both hands. And there's one for you, and another, and another. 200 million kisses, my angel. Simon, giggling. What a lot! Paul. It is. You're quite right. 200 million. I come, my Juliet. He darts into the hotel, pausing when just inside the door and out of sight of the Baroness, to mop himself once again with his enormous handkerchief. The operation over, he advances with a resolute step. The Baroness stands for a moment on the balcony, then, seeing Dolphin and Lucrezia coming in from the left, she retires, closing the window and drawing the curtains behind her. Dolphin comes striding in. Lucrezia follows a little behind, looking anxiously up at him. Dolphin. No, I won't listen to anything more. He walks with an agitated step up and down the stage. Lucrezia stands with one hand resting on the back of a chair and the other pressed on her heart. Do you mean to say you deliberately went and told her that I was only after her money? Oh, it's too bad, too bad. It's infamous. And I hadn't the faintest notion that she had any money. Besides, I don't want money. I have quite enough of my own. It's infamous, infamous. Lucrezia. I know it was a horrible thing to do, but I couldn't help it. How could I stand by and see you being carried off by that silly little creature? Dolphin. But I cared for her. Lucrezia. But not as I cared for you. I've got red blood in my veins. She's got nothing but milk and water. You couldn't have been happy with her. I can give you love of a kind she could never dream of. What does she know of passion? Dolphin. Nothing, I'm thankful to say. I don't want passion. Can't you understand that? I don't possess it myself, and don't like it in others. I am a man of sentimental affections with a touch of quiet sensuality. I don't want passion. I tell you, it's too violent. It frightens me. I couldn't possibly live with you. You'd utterly shatter my peace of mind in a day. Oh, how I wish you'd go away. Lucrezia. But Sidney, can't you understand what it is to be madly in love with somebody? You can't be so cruel. Dolphin. You didn't think much of my well-being when you interfered between Miss Toomis and me, did you? You've probably ruined my whole life, that's all. I really don't see why you should expect me to have any pity for you. Lucrezia. Very well, then, I shall kill myself. She bursts into tears. Dolphin. Oh, but I assure you one doesn't kill oneself for things like that. He approaches her and pats her on the shoulder. Come, come, don't worry about it. Lucrezia throws her arms round his neck. Oh, Sidney! Dolphin, freeing himself with surprising energy and promptitude from her embrace. No, none of that, I beg. Another moment, and we shall be losing our heads. Personally, I think I shall go to bed now. I should advise you to do the same, Miss Grattarol. You're overwrought. We might all be better for a small dose of bromide. He goes in. Lucrezia, looking up and stretching forth her hands. Dolphin does not look round, and disappears through the glass door into the hotel. Lucrezia covers her face with her hands and sits for a little while, sobbing silently. The nightingale sings on. Midnight sounds, with an infinite melancholy, from all the 20 campaniles of the city in the valley. From far away comes the spasmodic throbbing of a guitar and the singing of an Italian voice, high-pitched, passionate, throaty. The seconds pass. Lucrezia rises to her feet and walks slowly into the hotel. On the threshold she encountered the Vicomte coming out. Paul. Signorina Lucrezia, I've escaped for a breath of fresh air. Mightn't we take a turn together? Lucrezia shakes her head. Ah, well, good night, then. You'll be glad to hear that Miss Dumas knows all about Correggio now. He inhales a deep breath of air. Then, looking at his dinner jacket, he begins brushing at it with his hand. A lamentable figure creeps in from the left. It is Alberto. If he had had a tail, it would be trailing on the ground between his legs. Paul. Hello, Alberto. What is it? Been losing at cards? Alberto. Worse than that. Paul. Creditors foreclosing? Alberto. Much worse. Paul. A father ruined by imprudent speculations? Alberto. No, no, no. It is nothing to do with money. Paul. Oh, well, then it can't be anything very serious. It's women, I suppose. Alberto. My mistress refuses to see me. I have been beating on her door for hours in vain. Paul. I wish we all had your luck, Bertino. Mine opens her door only too promptly. The difficulty is to get out again. Does yours use such an awful lot of this evil-smelling powder? I'm simply covered with it. He brushes his coat again. Alberto. Can't you be serious, Paul? Paul. Of course I can, about a serious matter. But you can't expect me to pull a long face about your mistress, can you now? Do look at things in their right proportions. Alberto. It's no use talking to you. You're heartless, soulless. Paul. What you mean, my dear Alberto, is that I'm relatively speaking bodiless. Physical passion never goes to my head. I'm always compos mentis. You aren't. That's all. Alberto. Oh, you disgust me. I think I shall go hang myself tonight. Paul. Do. It will give us something to talk about at lunch tomorrow. Alberto. Monster. He goes into the hotel. Paul strolls out towards the garden, whistling an air from Mozart as he goes. The window on the left opens, and Lucrezia steps onto her balcony. Uncoiled, her red hair falls almost to her waist. Her night-dress is always half slipping off one shoulder or the other, like those loose-bodied restoration gowns that reveal the tight-flown charms of Kneller's beauties. Her feet are bare. She is a marvellously romantic figure as she stands there, leaning on the balustrade, and with eyes more sombre than the night, gazing into the darkness. The nightingales, the bells, the guitar, and passionate voice strike up. Great stars palpitate in the sky. The moon has swum imperceptibly to the height of heaven. In the garden below, flowers are yielding their souls into the air. Sensés invisibles. It is too much. Too much. Large tears roll down Lucrezia's cheeks and fall with a splash to the ground. Suddenly, but with the noiselessness of a cat, Alberto appears, childish-looking in pink pyjamas, on the middle of the three balconies. He sees Lucrezia, but she is much too deeply absorbed in thought to have noticed his coming. Alberto plants his elbows on the rail of the balcony, covers his face, and begins to sob. At first inaudibly, then in a gradually quickening crescendo. At the seventh sob, Lucrezia starts and becomes aware of his presence. Lucrezia. Have you been there long? Alberto makes no articulate reply, but his sobs keep on growing louder. Alberto, are you unhappy? Answer me. Alberto, with difficulty, after a pause. Yes. Lucrezia. Didn't she let you in? Alberto. No. His sobs become convulsive. Lucrezia. Poor boy. Alberto. lifting up a blubbered face to the moonlight. "I am so unhappy, Lucrezia." "You can't be more unhappy than I am, Alberto." "Oh, yes, I am. It's impossible to be unhappier than me, Lucrezia." "But I am more unhappy, Alberto." "You're not. Oh, how can you be so cruel, Lucrezia?" He covers his face once more. Lucrezia. "But I only said I was unhappy, Alberto." Alberto. "Yes, I know. That showed you weren't thinking of me. Nobody loves me. I shall hang myself tonight with the cord of my dressing gown." Lucrezia. "No, no, Alberto. You mustn't do anything rash." Alberto. "I shall. Your cruelty has been the last straw." Lucrezia. "I'm sorry, Bertino mio, but if you only knew how miserable I was feeling. I didn't mean to be unsympathetic. Poor boy, I'm so sorry. There, don't cry, poor darling." Alberto. "Oh, I knew you wouldn't desert me, Lucrezia. You've always been a mother to me." He stretches out his hand and seizes hers, which has gone halfway to meet him, but the balconies are too far apart to allow him to kiss it. He makes an effort and fails. He is too short in the body. "Will you let me come onto your balcony, Lucrezia? I want to tell you how grateful I am." Lucrezia. "But you can do that from your own balcony." Alberto. Please, please, Lucrezia, you mustn't be cruel to me again. I can't bear it." Lucrezia. "Well, then, just for a moment, but for no more." Bertino climbs from one balcony to the other. One is a little reminded of the trousered monkeys on the barrel organs. Arrived, he kneels down and kisses Lucrezia's hand. Alberto. "You've saved me. You've given me a fresh desire to live, and a fresh faith in life. How can I thank you enough, Lucrezia, darling?" Lucrezia, patting his head. "There, there. We are just two unhappy creatures. We must try and comfort one another." Alberto. "What a brute I am! I never thought of your unhappiness. I am so selfish. What is it, Lucrezia?" Lucrezia. "I can't tell you, Bertino, but it's very painful." Alberto. "Poor child, poor child." His kisses, which started at the hand, have mounted by this time some way up the arm, changing perceptibly in character as they rise. At the shoulder they have a warmth which could not have been inferred from the respectful salutes which barely touched the fingers. "Poor darling, you've given me consolation. Now you must let me comfort your unhappiness." Lucrezia, with an effort. "I think you ought to go back now, Bertino." Alberto. "In a minute, my darling. There, there, poor Lucrezia." He puts an arm round her, kisses her hair and neck. Lucrezia leans her bowed head against his chest. The sound of footsteps is heard. They both look up with scared, wide-opened eyes. Lucrezia. "We mustn't be seen here, Bertino. What would people think?" Alberto. "I'll go back." Lucrezia. "There's no time. You must come into my room quickly." They slip through the French window, but not quickly enough to have escaped the notice of Paul, returning from his midnight stroll. The Vicomte stands for a moment looking up at the empty balcony. He laughs softly to himself, and, throwing his cigarette away, passes through the glass door into the house. All is now silent, save for the nightingales and the distant bells. The curtain comes down for a moment to indicate the passage of several hours. It rises again with the sun. Lucrezia's window opens, and she appears on the balcony. She stands a moment with one foot over the threshold of the long window, in a listening pose. Then her eyes fall on the better half of a pair of pink pyjamas lying crumpled on the floor, like a body bereft of its soul. With her bare foot she turns it over. A little shudder plucks at her nerves, and she shakes her head as though, by this symbolic act, to shake off something clinging and contaminating. Then she steps out into the full glory of the early sun, stretching out her arms to the radiance. She bows her face into her hands, crying out loud to herself, Lucrezia. Oh, why, why, why? The last of these three whys is caught by the waiter, who has crept forth in shirt sleeves and list slippers, duster in hand, to clean the tables. He looks up at her and The Tillotson Banquet. Part 1. Young Spode was not a snob. He was too intelligent for that, too fundamentally decent. Not a snob. But, all the same, he could not help feeling very well pleased at the thought that he was dining, alone and intimately, with Lord Badgery. It was a definite event in his life, a step forward, he felt, towards that final success, social, material, and literary, which he had come to London with the fixed intention of making. The conquest and capture of Badgery was an almost essential strategical move in the campaign. Edmund, 47th Baron Badgery, was a lineal descendant of that Edmund, surnamed Le Blaireux, who landed on English soil in the train of William the Conqueror. Ennobled by William Rufus, the Badgerys had been one of the very few baronial families to survive the Wars of the Roses and all the other changes and chances of English history. They were a sensible and a philoprogenitive race. No Badgery had ever fought in any war. No Badgery had ever engaged in any kind of politics. They had been content to live and quietly to propagate their species in a huge, maculated Norman castle, surrounded by a triple moat, only sallying forth to cultivate their property and to collect their rents. In the 18th century, when life had become relatively secure, the Badgerys began to venture forth into civilised society. From boorish squires, they blossomed into grands seigneurs, patrons of the arts, virtuosi. Their property was large, they were rich, and with the growth of industrialism their riches also grew. Villages on their estate turned into manufacturing towns. Unsuspected coal was discovered beneath the surface of their barren moorlands. By the middle of the 19th century, the Badgerys were amongst the richest of English noble families. The 47th Baron disposed of an income of at least £200,000 a year. Following the great Badgery tradition, he had refused to have anything to do with politics or war. He occupied himself by collecting pictures. He took an interest in theatrical productions. He was the friend and patron of men of letters, of painters and musicians. A personage, in a word, of considerable consequence in that particular world in which young Spode had elected to make his success. Spode had only recently left the university. Simon Gollamy, the editor of The World's Review, the best of all possible worlds, had got to know him. He was always on the lookout for youthful talent, had seen possibilities in the young man, and appointed him art critic of his paper. Gollamy liked to have young and teachable people about him. The possession of disciples flattered his vanity, and he found it easier, moreover, to run his paper with docile collaborators than with men grown obstinate and case-hardened with age. Spode had not done badly at his new job. At any rate, his articles had been intelligent enough to arouse the interest of Lord Badgery. It was ultimately to them that he owed the honour of sitting to-night in the dining-room of Badgery House. Fortified by several varieties of wine and a glass of aged brandy, Spode felt more confident and at ease than he had done the whole evening. Badgery was rather a disquieting host. He had an alarming habit of changing the subject of any conversation that had lasted for more than 2 minutes. Spode had found it, for example, horribly mortifying when his host, cutting across what was, he prided himself, a particularly subtle and illuminating disquisition on Baroque art, had turned a wandering eye about the room and asked him, abruptly, whether he liked parrots. He had flushed, and glanced suspiciously towards him, fancying that the man was trying to be offensive. But no, Badgery's white, fleshy Hanoverian face wore an expression of perfect good faith. There was no malice in his small greenish eyes. He evidently did genuinely want to know if Spode liked parrots. The young man swallowed his irritation and replied that he did. Badgery then told a good story about parrots. Spode was on the point of capping it with a better story when his host began to talk about Beethoven. And so the game went on. Spode cut his conversation to suit his host's requirements. In the course of 10 minutes he had made a more or less witty epigram on Benvenuto Cellini, Queen Victoria, sport, God, Stephen Phillips, and Moorish architecture. Lord Badgery thought him the most charming young man, and so intelligent. "If you've quite finished your coffee," he said, rising to his feet as he spoke, "we'll go and look at the pictures." Spode jumped up with alacrity, and only then realised that he had drunk just ever so little too much. He would have to be careful, talk deliberately, plant his feet consciously, one after the other. "The house is quite cluttered up with pictures," Lord Badgery complained. "I had a whole waggon load taken away to the country last week, but there still are far too many. My ancestors would have their portraits painted by Romney. Such a shocking artist, don't you think? Why couldn't they have chosen Gainsborough, or even Reynolds? I've had all the Romneys hung in the servants' hall now. It's such a comfort to know that one can never possibly see them again. I suppose you know all about the ancient Hittites?" "Well," the young man replied, with befitting modesty. "Look at that, then." He indicated a large stone head, which stood in a case near the dining-room door. "It's not Greek, or Egyptian, or Persian, or anything else, so if it isn't ancient Hittite, I don't know what it is. And that reminds me of that story about Lord George Sanger, the Circus King." And, without giving Spode time to examine the Hittite relic, he led the way up the huge staircase, pausing every now and then in his anecdote to point out some new object of curiosity or beauty. "I suppose you know Deburau's pantomimes?" Spode rapped out, as soon as the story was over. He was in an itch to let out his information about Deburau. Badgery had given him a perfect opening with his ridiculous Sanger. "What a perfect man, isn't he? He used to—" "This is my main gallery," said Lord Badgery, throwing open one leaf of a tall folding door. "I must apologise for it. It looks like a roller skating rink." He fumbled with the electric switches, and there was suddenly light that revealed an enormous gallery, duly receding into distance according to all the laws of perspective. "I dare say you've heard of my poor father," Lord Badgery continued. "Little insane, you know. Sort of mechanical genius with a screw loose. He used to have a toy railway in this room. No end of fun he had, crawling about the floor after his trains. and all the pictures were stacked in the cellars. I can't tell you what they were like when I found them. Mushrooms growing out of the Botticellis. Now, I'm rather proud of this Poussin. He painted it for Scarron." "Exquisite!" Spode exclaimed, making with his hand a gesture as though he were modelling a pure form in air. "How splendid the onrush of those trees and leaning figures is! And the way they're caught up, as it were, stemmed by that single godlike form opposing them with his contrary movement. And the draperies!" But Lord Badgery had moved on, and was standing in front of a little 15th century Virgin of carved wood. "The school of Rheims," he explained. They "did" the gallery at high speed. Badgery never permitted his guest to halt for more than 40 seconds before any work of art. Spode would have liked to spend a few moments of recollection and tranquillity in front of some of these lovely things, but it was not permitted. The gallery done, they passed into a little room leading out of it. At the sight of what the lights revealed, Spode gasped. "It's like something out of Balzac!" he exclaimed. "Un de ces salons dorés où se déploie un luxe insolent, you know." "My 19th century chamber," Badgery explained. "The best thing of its kind, I flatter myself, outside the state apartments at Windsor." Spode tiptoed round the room, peering with astonishment at all the objects, in glass, in gilded bronze, in china, in leathers, in embroidered and painted silk, in beads, in wax, objects of the most fantastic shapes and colours, all the queer products of a decadent tradition with which the room was crowded. There were paintings on the walls: a Martin, a Wilkie, an early Landseer, several Etties, a big Haydn, a slight, pretty watercolour of a girl by Wainwright, the pupil of Blake and arsenic poisoner, and a score of others. But the picture which arrested Spode's attention was a medium-sized canvas representing Troilus riding into Troy among the flowers and plaudits of an admiring crowd, and oblivious (you could see this from his expression) of everything but the eyes of Cressida, who looked down at him from a window, with Pandarus smiling over her shoulder. "What an absurd and enchanting picture!" Spode exclaimed. "Ah, you've spotted my Troilus." Lord Badgery was pleased. "What bright, harmonious colours! Like Etty's, only stronger, not so obviously pretty. And there's an energy about it that reminds one of Haydn, only Haydn could never have done anything so impeccable in taste. Who is it by?" Spode turned to his host inquiringly. "You were right in detecting Haydn," Lord Badgery answered. "It's by his pupil, Tillotson. I wish I could get hold of more of his work, but nobody seems to know anything about him, and he seems to have done so little." This time it was the younger man who interrupted. "Tillotson, Tillotson." He put his hand to his forehead. A frown incongruously distorted his round, floridly curved face. "No, yes, I have it." He looked up triumphantly with serene and childish brows. "Tillotson, Walter Tillotson. The man's still alive." Badgery smiled. "This picture was painted in 1846, you know." "Well, that's all right. Say he was born in 1820, painted his masterpiece when he was 26, and it's 1913 now. That's to say he's only 93, not as old as Titian yet." "But he's not been heard of since 1860," Lord Badgery protested. "Precisely. Your mention of his name reminded me of the discovery I made the other day when I was looking through the obituary notices in the archives of the World's Review. One has to bring them up to date every year or so, for fear of being caught napping if one of these old birds chooses to shuffle off suddenly. Well, there among them, I remember my astonishment at the time, there I found Walter Tillotson's biography, pretty full to 1860, and then a blank, except for a pencil note in the early 1900s to the effect that he had returned from the East. The obituary has never been used or added to. I draw the obvious conclusion. The old chap isn't dead yet. He's just been overlooked somehow. "But this is extraordinary," Lord Badgerly exclaimed. "You must find him, Spode. You must find him. I'll commission him to paint frescoes round this room. Just what I've always vainly longed for. A real 19th century artist to decorate this place for me. Oh, we must find him at once. At once." Lord Badgerly strode up and down in a state of great excitement. "I can see how this room could be made quite perfect," he went on. "We'd clear away all these cases, and have the whole of that wall filled by a heroic fresco of Hector and Andromache, or Distraining for Rent, or Fanny Kemble as Belvidera in Venice Preserved, anything like that, provided it's in the grand manner of the 30s and 40s. And here I'd have a landscape with lovely receding perspectives, or else something architectural and grand in the style of Belshazzar's Feast. Then we'll have this Adam's fireplace taken down and replaced by something Moro Gothic. And on these walls I'll have mirrors, or no, let me see." He sank into meditative silence, from which he finally roused himself to shout, the old man, Spode, we must find this astonishing old creature. And don't breathe a word to anybody. Tillotson shall be our secret. Oh, it's too perfect. It's incredible. Think of the frescoes." Lord Badgerly's face had become positively animated. He had talked of a single subject for nearly a quarter of an hour. 3 weeks later, Lord Badgerly was aroused from his usual after-luncheon somnolence by the arrival of a telegram. The message was a short one. "Found. Spode." A look of pleasure and intelligence made human Lord Badgerly's clayey face of surfeit. "No answer," he said. The footman padded away on noiseless feet. Lord Badgerly closed his eyes and began to contemplate. Found. What a room he would have! There would be nothing like it in the world. The frescoes, the fireplace, the mirrors, the ceiling, and a small, shrivelled old man clambering about the scaffolding, agile and quick, like one of those whiskered little monkeys at the zoo, painting away, painting away. Fanny Kemble as Belvidera, Hector and Andromache, or why not the Duke of Clarence in the butt, the Duke of Malmsey, the butt of Clarence. Lord Badgerly was asleep. Spode did not lag long behind his telegram. He was at Badgerly House by 6 o'clock. His lordship was in the 19th century chamber, engaged in clearing away with his own hands the bric-a-brac. Spode found him looking hot and out of breath. "Ah, there you are," said Lord Badgerly. "You see me already preparing for the great man's coming. Now you must tell me all about him." "He's older even than I thought," said Spode. "He's 97 this year. Born in 1816. It's incredible, isn't it? There, I'm beginning at the wrong end." "Begin where you like," said Badgerly genially. "I won't tell you all the incidents of the hunt. You've no idea what a job I had to run him to earth. It was like a Sherlock Holmes story. Immensely elaborate. Too elaborate. I shall write a book about it some day. At any rate, I found him at last." "Where?" "In a sort of respectable slum in Holloway, older and poorer and lonelier than you could have believed possible. I found out how it was he came to be forgotten, how he came to drop out of life in the way he did. He took it into his head, somewhere about the 60s, to go to Palestine to get local colour for his religious pictures. Scapegoats and things, you know. Well, he went on to Jerusalem, and then on to Mount Lebanon, and on and on. And then, somewhere in the middle of Asia Minor, he got stuck. He got stuck for about 40 years. But what did he do all that time? Oh, he painted, and started a mission, and converted 3 Turks, and taught the local pashas the rudiments of English, Latin, and perspective, and God knows what else. Then, in about 1904, it seems to have occurred to him that he was getting rather old, and had been away from home for rather a long time. So he made his way back to England, only to find that everyone he had known was dead, that the dealers had never heard of him and wouldn't buy his pictures, that he was simply a ridiculous old figure of fun. So he got a job as a drawing master in a girls' school in Holloway, and there he's been ever since, growing older and older, and feebler, and blinder and deafer, and generally more gaga, until finally the school has given him the sack. He had about £10 in the world when I found him. He lives in a kind of black hole in a basement full of beetles. When his £10 are spent, I suppose he'll just quietly die there." Badgery held up a white hand. "No more, no more. I find literature quite depressing enough. I insist that life, at least, shall be a little gayer. Did you tell him I wanted him to paint my room?" "But he can't paint. He's too blind and palsied." "Can't paint?" Badgery exclaimed in horror. "Then what's the good of the old creature?" "Well, if you put it like that," Spode began. "I shall never have my frescoes. Ring the bell, will you?" Spode rang. "What right has Tillotson to go on existing if he can't paint?" went on Lord Badgery petulantly. "After all, that was his only justification for occupying a place in the sun." "He doesn't have much sun in his basement." The footman appeared at the door. "Get someone to put all these things back in their places," Lord Badgery commanded, indicating with a wave of the hand the ravaged cases, the confusion of glass and china with which he had littered the floor, the pictures unhooked. "We'll go to the library, Spode. It's more comfortable there." He led the way through the long gallery and down the stairs. "I'm sorry old Tillotson has been such a disappointment," said Spode sympathetically. "Let us talk about something else. He ceases to interest me." "But don't you think we ought to do something about him? He's only got £10 between him and the workhouse. And if you'd seen the black beetles in his basement—" "Enough, enough. I'll do everything you think fitting." "I thought we might get up a subscription amongst lovers of arts." "There aren't any," said Badgery. "No, but there are plenty of people who will subscribe out of snobism." "Not unless you give them something for their money." "That's true. I hadn't thought of that." Spode was silent for a moment. "We might have a dinner in his honour. The Great Tillotson Banquet. Doyen of the British art. A link with the past. Can't you see it in the papers? I'd make a stunt of it in the World's Review. That ought to bring the snobs in. And we'll invite a lot of artists and critics. All the ones who can't stand one another. It will be fun to see them squabbling." Badgery laughed. Then his face darkened once again. "Still," he added, "it'll be a very poor second best to my frescoes. You'll stay to dinner, of course?" "Well, since you suggest it, thanks very much." End of chapter 3. Part 1. The Tillotson Banquet. Part 2. The Tillotson Banquet was fixed to take place about 3 weeks later. Spode, who had charge of the arrangements, proved himself an excellent organizer. He secured the big banqueting room at the Café Bomba, and was successful in bullying and cajoling the manager into giving 50 persons dinner at 12 shillings a head, including wine. He sent out invitations and collected subscriptions. He wrote an article on Tillotson in the World's Review, one of those charming, witty articles couched in the tone of amused patronage and contempt with which one speaks of the great men of 1840. Nor did he neglect Tillotson himself. He used to go to Holloway almost every day to listen to the old man's endless stories about Asia Minor, and the Great Exhibition of '51, and Benjamin Robert Hayden. He was sincerely sorry for this relic of another age. Mr. Tillotson's room was about 10 feet below the level of the soil of South Holloway. A little grey light percolated through the area bars, forced a difficult passage through panes opaque with dirt, and spent itself, like a drop of milk that falls into an ink-pot, among the inveterate shadows of the dungeon. The place was haunted by the spur smell of damp plaster and of woodwork that has begun to moulder secretly at the heart. A little miscellaneous furniture, including a bed, a washstand and chest of drawers, a table, and 1 or 2 chairs, lurked in the obscure corners of the den or ventured furtively out into the open. Hither Spode now came almost daily, bringing the old man news of the progress of the banquet scheme. Every day he found Mr. Tillotson sitting in the same place under the window, bathing, as it were, in his tiny puddle of light. "The oldest man that ever wore grey hairs," Spode reflected as he looked at him. Only there were very few hairs left on that bald, unpolished head. At the sound of the visitor's knock, Mr. Tillotson would turn in his chair, stare in the direction of the door with blinking, uncertain eyes. He was always full of apologies for being so slow in recognizing who was there. "It's not as if I had forgotten who you were, only it's so dark, and my sight isn't what it was." After that he never failed to give a little laugh, and, pointing out of the window at the area railings, would say, "Ah, this is the place for somebody with good sight. It's the place for looking at ankles. It's the grand stand." It was the day before the great event. Spode came, as usual, and Mr. Tillotson punctually made his little jokes about the ankles, and Spode, as punctually, laughed. "Well, Mr. Tillotson," he said, after the reverberation of the joke had died away, "to-morrow you make your re-entry into the world of art and fashion. You'll find some changes." "I've always had such extraordinary luck," said Mr. Tillotson, and Spode could see by his expression that he genuinely believed it, that he had forgotten the black hole and the black beetles, and the almost exhausted £10 that stood between him and the workhouse. "What an amazing piece of good fortune, for instance, that you should have found me just when you did. Now, this dinner will bring me back to my place in the world. I shall have money, and in a little while, who knows, I shall be able to see well enough to paint again. I believe my eyes are getting better, you know. Ah, the future is very rosy." Mr. Tillotson looked up, his face puckered into a smile, and nodded his head in affirmation of his words. "You believe in the life to come?" said Spode, and immediately flushed for shame at the cruelty of the words. but Mr. Tillotson was in far too cheerful a mood to have caught their significance. "Life to come," he repeated. "No, I don't believe in any of that stuff. Not since 1859. The origin of species changed my views, you know. No life to come for me, thank you. You don't remember the excitement, of course. You're very young, Mr. Spode." "Well, I'm not so old as I was," Spode replied. "You know how middle-aged one is as a schoolboy and undergraduate. Now I'm old enough to know I'm young." Spode was about to develop this little paradox further, but he noticed that Mr. Tillotson had not been listening. He made a note of the gambit for use in companies that were more appreciative of subtleties. "You were talking about the origin of species," he said. "Was I?" said Mr. Tillotson, waking from reverie. "About its effects on your faith, Mr. Tillotson." "To be sure, yes. It shattered my faith. But I remember a fine thing by the poet laureate, something about there being more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in all the I forget exactly what, but you see the train of thought. Oh, it was a bad time for religion. I am glad my master Haydn never lived to see it. He was a man of fervour. I remember him pacing up and down his studio in Lisson Grove, singing and shouting and praying all at once. It used almost to frighten me. Oh, but he was a wonderful man, a great man. Take him for all in all, we shall not look upon his like again. As usual, the bard is right. But it was all very long ago, before your time, Mr. Spode." "Well, I'm not as old as I was," said Spode, in the hope of having his paradox appreciated this time, but Mr. Tillotson went on without noticing the interruption. "It's a very, very long time, and yet, when I look back on it, it all seems but a day or two ago. Strange that each day should seem so long, and that many days added together should be less than an hour. How clearly I can see old Haydn pacing up and down. Much more clearly indeed than I see you, Mr. Spode. The eyes of memory don't grow dim. But my sight is improving, I assure you. It's improving daily. I shall soon be able to see those ankles." He laughed like a cracked bell, one of those little old bells, Spode fancied, that ring, with much rattling of wires, in the far-off servants' quarters of ancient houses. "And very soon," Mr. Tillotson went on, "I shall be painting again. Ah, Mr. Spode, my luck is extraordinary. I believe in it. I trust in it. And after all, what is luck? Simply another name for Providence, in spite of the origin of species and the rest of it. How right the laureate was when he said that there was more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in all well, you know. I regard you, Mr. Spode, as the emissary of Providence. Your coming marked a turning point in my life, and the beginning for me of happier days. Do you know, one of the first things I shall do when my fortunes are restored will be to buy a hedgehog." "A hedgehog, Mr. Tillotson?" "For the black beetles. There's nothing like a hedgehog for beetles. It will eat black beetles till it's sick, till it dies of surfeit. That reminds me of the time when I told my poor great master Haydn, in joke, of course, that he ought to send in a cartoon of King John dying of a surfeit of lampreys for the frescoes in the new Houses of Parliament. As I told him,
It's a most notable event in the annals of British liberty, the providential and exemplary removal of a tyrant." Mr. Tillotson laughed again. The little bell in the deserted house. A ghostly hand pulling the cord in the drawing-room, and phantom footmen responding to the thin, flawed note. I remember he laughed like a bull in his old grand manner. But, oh, it was a terrible blow when they rejected his design, a terrible blow. It was the first and fundamental cause of his suicide. Mr. Tillotson paused. There was a long silence. Spode felt strangely moved, he hardly knew why, in the presence of this man, so frail, so ancient, in body 3 parts dead, in the spirit so full of life and hopeful patience. He felt ashamed. What was the use of his own youth and cleverness? He saw himself suddenly as a boy with a rattle scaring birds, rattling his noisy cleverness, waving his arms in ceaseless and futile activity, never resting in his efforts to scare away the birds that were always trying to settle in his mind. And what birds! Wide-winged and beautiful, all those serene thoughts and faiths and emotions that only visit minds that have humbled themselves to quiet. Those gracious visitants he was for ever using all his energies to drive away. But this old man, with his hedgehogs, and his honest doubts and all the rest of it, his mind was like a field made beautiful by the free coming and going, the unafraid alightings of a multitude of white, bright-winged creatures. He felt ashamed. But then, was it possible to alter one's life? Wasn't it a little absurd to risk a conversion? Spode shrugged his shoulders. "I'll get you a hedgehog at once," he said. "They're sure to have some at Whiteley's." Before he left that evening, Spode made an alarming discovery. Mr. Tillotson did not possess a dress suit. It was hopeless to think of getting one made at this short notice, and besides, what an unnecessary expense. "We shall have to borrow a suit, Mr. Tillotson. I ought to have thought of that before." Dear me, dear me! Mr. Tillotson was a little chagrined by this unlucky discovery. Borrow a suit? Spode hurried away for counsel to Badgery House. Lord Badgery surprisingly rose to the occasion. "Ask Boreham to come and see me," he told the footman who answered his ring. Boreham was one of those immemorial butlers who linger on, generation after generation, in the houses of the great. He was over 80 now, bent, dried up, shrivelled with age. "All old men are about the same size," said Lord Badgery. It was a comforting theory. "Ah, here he is. Have you got a spare suit of evening clothes, Boreham?" "I have an old suit, my lord, that I stopped wearing in, let me see, was it 1907 or 8? "That's the very thing. I should be most grateful, Boreham, if you could lend it to me for Mr. Spode here for a day." The old man went out, and soon reappeared, carrying over his arm a very old black suit. He held up the coat and trousers for inspection. In the light of day they were deplorable. "You've no idea, sir," said Boreham deprecatingly to Spode, "you've no idea how easy things get stained with grease and gravy and what not, however careful you are, sir, however careful." "I should imagine so." Spode was sympathetic. "However careful, sir." "But in artificial light they'll look all right." "Perfectly all right," Lord Badgery repeated. "Thank you, Boreham. You shall have them back on Thursday." "You're welcome, my lord, I'm sure." and the old man bowed and disappeared. On the afternoon of the great day, Spode carried up to Holloway a parcel containing Boreham's retired evening suit and all the necessary appurtenances in the way of shirts and collars. Owing to the darkness and his own feeble sight, Mr. Tillotson was happily unaware of the defects of the suit. He was in a state of extreme nervous agitation. It was with some difficulty that Spode could prevent him, although it was only 3 o'clock, from starting his toilet on the spot. "Take it easy, Mr. Tillotson, take it easy. We needn't start till 7:30, you know." Spode left an hour later, and as soon as he was safely out of the room, Mr. Tillotson began to prepare himself for the banquet. He lighted the gas and a couple of candles, and blinking myopically at the image that fronted him in the tiny looking-glass that stood on his chest of drawers, he set to work with all the ardour of a young girl preparing for her first ball. At 6 o'clock, when the last touches had been given, he was not unsatisfied. He marched up and down his cellar, humming to himself the gay song which had been so popular in his middle years. "Oh, oh, Anna Maria Jones, Queen of the tambourine, the cymbals and the bones." Spode arrived an hour later in Lord Badgerly's second Rolls-Royce. Opening the door of the old man's dungeon, he stood for a moment, wide-eyed with astonishment, on the threshold. Mr. Tillotson was standing by the empty grate, one elbow resting on the mantelpiece, one leg crossed over the other in a jaunty and gentlemanly attitude. The effect of the candlelight shining on his face was to deepen every line and wrinkle with intense black shadow. He looked immeasurably old. It was a noble and pathetic head. On the other hand, Boreham's outworn evening suit was simply buffoonish. The coat was too long in the sleeves and the tail, the trousers bagged in elephantine creases about his ankles. Some of the grease spots were visible even in candlelight. The white tie, over which Mr. Tillotson had taken infinite pains, and which he believed, in his purblindness, to be perfect, was fantastically lopsided. He had buttoned up his waistcoat in such a fashion that one button was widowed of its hole, and one hole of its button. Across his shirt-front lay the broad green ribbon of some unknown order. "Queen of the tambourine, the cymbals and the bones," Mr. Tillotson concluded in a gnat-like voice before welcoming his visitor. "Well, Spode, here you are. I'm dressed already, you see. The suit, I flatter myself, fits very well, almost as though it had been made for me. I am all gratitude to the gentleman who was kind enough to lend it to me. I shall take the greatest care of it. It's a dangerous thing to lend clothes, for loan oft loseth both itself and friend. The bard is always right." "Just one thing," said Spode. "A touch to your waistcoat." He unbuttoned the dissipated garment and did it up again more symmetrically. Mr. Tillotson was a little piqued at being found so absurdly in the wrong. "Thanks, thanks," he said protestingly, trying to edge away from his valet. "It's all right, you know. I can do it myself. Foolish oversight. I flatter myself the suit fits very well." "And perhaps the tie might—" Spode began tentatively, but the old man would not hear of it. "No, no, the tie's all right. I can tie a tie, Mr. Spode. The tie's all right. Leave it as it is, I beg." "I like your order." Mr. Tillotson looked down complacently at his shirt-front. You've noticed my order. It's a long time since I wore that. It was given me by the Grand Porte, you know, for services rendered in the Russo-Turkish War. It's the Order of Chastity, the second class. They only give the first class to crowned heads, you know. Crowned heads and ambassadors. And only pashas of the highest rank get the second. Mine's the second. They only give the first class to crowned heads. Of course, said Spode. Do you think I look all right, Mr. Spode? Mr. Tillotson asked, a little anxiously. Splendid, Mr. Tillotson, splendid. The order's magnificent. The old man's face brightened once more. I flatter myself, he said, that this borrowed suit fits me very well. But I don't like borrowing clothes, for loan oft loseth both itself and friend, you know, and the bard is always right. There's one of those horrible beetles, Spode exclaimed. Mr. Tillotson bent down and stared at the floor. I see it, he said, and stamped on a small piece of coal which crunched to powder under his foot. I shall certainly buy a hedgehog. It was time for them to start. A crowd of little boys and girls had collected round Lord Badgerly's enormous car. The chauffeur, who felt that honour and dignity were at stake, pretended not to notice the children, but sat gazing like a statue into eternity. At the sight of Spode and Mr. Tillotson emerging from the house, a yell of mingled awe and derision went up. It subsided to an astonished silence as they climbed into the car. Bombas, Spode directed. The Rolls-Royce gave a faintly stertorous sigh and began to move. The children yelled again and ran alongside the car, waving their arms in a frenzy of excitement. It was then that Mr. Tillotson, with an incomparably noble gesture, leaned forward and tossed among the seething crowd of urchins his last 3 coppers. In Bomba's big room the company was assembling. The long gilt-edged mirrors reflected a singular collection of people. Middle-aged academicians shot suspicious glances at youths whom they suspected, only too correctly, of being iconoclasts, organisers of post-impressionist exhibitions. Rival art critics, brought suddenly face to face, quivered with restrained hatred. Mrs. Nobes, Mrs. Cayman, and Mrs. Madragore, those indefatigable hunters of artistic big game, came on one another all unawares in this well-stored menagerie, where each had expected to hunt alone, and were filled with rage. Through this crowd of mutually repellent vanities Lord Badgery moved with a suavity that seemed unconscious of all the feuds and hatreds. He was enjoying himself immensely. Behind the heavy waxen mask of his face, ambushed behind the Hanoverian nose, the little lustreless pig's eyes, the pale thick lips, there lurked a small devil of happy malice that rocked with laughter. Mrs. Mandragore, and I'm so glad to see you've brought dear Mrs. Cayman. And is that Mrs. Nobes, too? So it is. I hadn't noticed her before. How delightful. I knew we could depend on your love of art. And he hurried away to seize the opportunity of introducing that eminent sculptor, Sir Herbert Herne, to the bright young critic who had called him, in the public prints, a monumental mason. A moment later the maître d'hôtel came to the door of the gilded saloon and announced, loudly and impressively, Mr. Walter Tillotson. Guided from behind by young Spode, Mr. Tillotson came into the room slowly and hesitatingly. In the glare of the lights his eyelids beat heavily, painfully, like the wings of an imprisoned moth over his filmy eyes. Once inside the door, he halted and drew himself up with a conscious assumption of dignity. Lord Badgery hurried forward and seized his hand. "Welcome, Mr. Tillotson. Welcome in the name of English art." Mr. Tillotson inclined his head in silence. He was too full of emotion to be able to reply. "I should like to introduce you to a few of your younger colleagues who have assembled here to do you honour." Lord Badgery presented every one in the room to the old painter, who bowed, shook hands, made little noises in his throat, but still found himself unable to speak. Mrs. Nobes, Mrs. Cayman, and Mrs. Mandragore all said charming things. Dinner was served. The party took their places. Lord Badgery sat at the head of the table, with Mr. Tillotson on his right hand and Sir Herbert Herne on his left. Confronted with Bomba's succulent cooking and Bomba's wines, Mr. Tillotson ate and drank a good deal. He had the appetite of one who has lived on greens and potatoes for 10 years among the blackbeetles. After the second glass of wine, he began to talk, suddenly and in a flood, as though a sluice had been pulled up. "In Asia Minor," he began, "it is the custom, when one goes to dinner, to hiccup as a sign of appreciative fullness. Eructavit cor meum, as the psalmist has it. He was an Oriental himself." Spode had arranged to sit next to Mrs. Cayman. He had designs upon her. She was an impossible woman, of course, but rich and useful. He wanted to bamboozle her into buying some of his young friend's pictures. "In a cellar," Mrs. Cayman was saying, "with black beetles? Oh, how dreadful! Poor old man! And he's 97, didn't you say? Isn't that shocking? I only hope the subscription will be a large one. Of course, one wishes one could have given more oneself. But then, you know, one has so many expenses, and things are so difficult now." I know," said Spode, with feeling. "It's all because of labour," Mrs. Cayman explained. "Of course, I should simply love to have him in to dinner sometimes, but then I feel he's really too old, too farouche and gâteux. It would not be doing a kindness to him, would it? And so you are working with Mr. Gollamy now? But a charming man, so talented, such conversation." "Eructavit cor meum," said Mr. Tillotson for the third time. Lord Badgery tried to head him off the subject of Turkish etiquette, but in vain. By 9:30, a kinder, vinolent atmosphere had put to sleep the hatreds and suspicions of before dinner. Sir Herbert Herne had discovered that the young cubist sitting next to him was not insane, and actually knew a surprising amount about the old masters. For their part, these young men had realised that their elders were not at all malignant. They were just very stupid and pathetic. It was only in the bosoms of Mrs. Nobes, Mrs. Cayman, and Mrs. Mandragore that hatred still reigned undiminished. Being ladies, and old-fashioned, they had drunk almost no wine. The moment for speech-making arrived. Lord Badgery rose to his feet, said what was expected of him, and called upon Sir Herbert to propose the toast of the evening. Sir Herbert coughed, smiled, and began. In the course of a speech that lasted 20 minutes, He told anecdotes of Mr. Gladstone, Lord Leighton, Sir Elmo Tadema, and the late Bishop of Bombay. He made 3 puns. He quoted Shakespeare and Whittier. He was playful. He was eloquent. He was grave. At the end of his harangue, Sir Herbert handed to Mr. Tillotson a silk purse containing £58 10s, the total amount of the subscription. The old man's health was drunk with acclamation. Mr. Tillotson rose with difficulty to his feet. The dry, snake-like skin of his face was flushed. His tie was more crooked than ever. The green ribbon of the Order of Chastity of the second class had somehow climbed up his crumpled and maculated shirt front. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen," he began in a choking voice, and then broke down completely. It was a very painful and pathetic spectacle. A feeling of intense discomfort afflicted the minds of all who looked upon that trembling relic of a man as he stood there weeping and stammering. It was as though a breath of the wind of death had blown suddenly through the room, lifting the vapours of wine and tobacco smoke, quenching the laughter and the candle flames. Eyes floated uneasily, not knowing where to look. Lord Badgery, with great presence of mind, offered the old man a glass of wine. Mr. Tillotson began to recover. The guests heard him murmur a few disconnected words. "This great honour, overwhelmed with kindness. This magnificent banquet, not used to it. In Asia Minor, ructuvit cor meum." At this point, Lord Badgery plucked sharply at one of his long coat tails. Mr. Tillotson paused, took another sip of wine, and then went on with a newly won coherence and energy. "The life of the artist is a hard one. His work is unlike other men's work, which may be done mechanically, by rote almost, as it were, in sleep. It demands from him a constant expense of spirit. He gives continually of his best life, and in return he receives much joy. It is true, much fame it may be, but of material blessings very few. It is 80 years since I first devoted myself to the service of art. 80 years, and almost every one of those years has brought me fresh and painful proof of what I have been saying. An artist's life is a hard one." This unexpected deviation into sense increased the general feeling of discomfort. It became necessary to take the old man seriously, to regard him as a human being. Up till then he had been no more than an object of curiosity, a mummy in an absurd suit of evening clothes, with a green ribbon across the shirt front. People could not help wishing that they had subscribed a little more. £58 10. It was not enormous. But, happily for the peace of mind of the company, Mr. Tillotson paused again, took another sip of wine, and began to live up to his proper character by talking absurdly. "When I consider the life of that great man, Benjamin Robert Haydon, one of the greatest men England has ever produced." The audience heaved a sigh of relief. This was all as it should be. There was a burst of loud bravoing and clapping. Mr. Tillotson turned his dim eyes round the room, and smiled gratefully at the misty figures he beheld. "That great man, Benjamin Robert Haydon," he continued, "whom I am proud to call my master, and who, it rejoices my heart to see, still lives in your memory and esteem, that great man, one of the greatest that England has ever led, a life so deplorable that I cannot think of it without a tear." And with infinite repetitions and divagations, Mr. Tillotson related the history of B.R. Haydon, his imprisonments for debt, his battle with the Academy, his triumphs, his failures, his despair, his suicide. 10:30 struck. Mr. Tillotson was declaiming against the stupid and prejudiced judges who had rejected Haydon's designs for the decoration of the new Houses of Parliament in favour of the paltriest German scribblings. That great man, one of the greatest England has ever produced, that great Benjamin Robert Haydon, whom I am proud to call my master, and who, it rejoices me to see, still lives on in your memory and esteem, at that affront his great heart burst. It was the unkindest cut of all. He, who had worked all his life for the recognition of the artist by the State, he who had petitioned every Prime Minister, including the Duke of Wellington, for 30 years, begging them to employ artists to decorate public buildings, he to whom the scheme for decorating the Houses of Parliament was undeniably due. Mr. Tillotson lost a grip on his syntax and began a new sentence. It was the unkindest cut of all. It was the last straw. The artist's life is a hard one. At 11, Mr. Tillotson was talking about the Pre-Raphaelites. At 1:15, he had begun to tell the story of B.R. Haydon all over again. At 25 minutes to 12, he collapsed, quite speechless, into his chair. Most of the guests had already gone away. The few who remained made haste to depart. Lord Badgery led the old man to the door and packed him into the second Rolls Royce. The Tillotson banquet was over. It had been a pleasant evening, but a little too long. Spode walked back to his rooms in Bloomsbury, whistling as he went. The arc lamps of Oxford Street reflected in the polished surface of the road canals of dark bronze. He would have to bring that into an article some time. The Cayman woman had been very successfully nobbled. Voi che sapete, he whistled, somewhat out of tune, but he could not hear that. When Mr. Tillotson's landlady came in to call him on the following morning, she found the old man lying, fully dressed, on his bed. He looked very ill and very, very old. Boreham's dress suit was in a terrible state, and the green ribbon of the Order of Chastity was ruined. Mr. Tillotson lay very still, but he was not asleep. Hearing the footsteps, he opened his eyes a little and faintly groaned. His landlady looked down at him menacingly. "Disgusting," she said. "Disgusting, I call it. At your..." Mr. Tillotson groaned again. Making a great effort, he drew out of his trouser pocket a large silk purse, opened it, and extracted a sovereign. "The artist's life is a hard one, Mrs. Green," he said, handing her the coin. "Would you mind sending for the doctor? I don't feel very well. And, oh, what shall I do about these clothes? What shall I say to the gentleman who was kind enough to lend them to me? Loan oft loseth both itself and friend. The bard is always right." End of chapter 3.